Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to be here with all of you tonight. We're going to have yet another great late night conversation, just like we always do. So, yeah, here we go.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, 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 everybody. So glad that you are all here tonight for yet another great late night chat. We are going to talk about a lot of different things tonight. Now, the way we do this, it'll be following our usual format, which is first my opening remarks, then the roll call, and then I answer your questions for the remainder of the night. Now, questions can be sent as Rumble Rants. They can be sent via Cash App, Caleb Moppin 22. But the best way, the absolute best way to send your questions would be buy me a coffee. And a few people have already done it. We've got a whole list of questions to start out with tonight. I didn't stream the last 2 nights, and you all came up with questions in my absence, and that is appreciated. Send more questions, and I will give more answers. So that's great. The second half of the show is all you. Buy me a coffee. You can do it anytime. I don't have to be live. And yeah, so I'm looking forward to doing more questions tonight. Buy me a coffee to get your questions answered. Now, the big announcement that we've got is that the Center for Political Innovation is having a spring, I should say, a January New Year's get-together in New Jersey at a hotel in New Jersey. It is going to be awesome. Garland Nixon is going to be there. We're honoring 4 local anti-imperialist organizers. It's going to be great. Music, speeches, full buffet. It's going to be absolutely awesome. We're ordering banners and we're getting everything together, and everyone who comes is going to get the convention booklet, the proceedings of last year's convention, the big coffee table book we made of the convention from last year. Everyone's going to get one of these. Everyone who comes, I'm getting those from the printers, and oh man, it's going to be great. So if you are in the area, or if you want to come into town or whatever, it's going to be a great get together in New Jersey. So I'm looking forward to the event. So I hope to see you all there. Now, to attend, you'll need to register on the Eventbrite, January 11th. Here is the Eventbrite page. I'm dropping it in the chat, dropping it in the Rumble chat. That is how you sign up for the event. So I hope to see you all there. Should be a great get-together to kind of set us in motion, building our anti-globalist, anti-imperialist organization for the coming year. I'm working on my end-of-the-year report that'll come out probably in the last days of December, going over everything we've done this year. It's going to be a long video, I'll tell you that. We have done a lot this year. We are out there doing it. We are a real anti-imperialist organization doing real outreach, doing great work. And I mean, we've got a great year ahead of us. We're already off to a great start. The new year hasn't even started yet. We're already kickstarting and speeding ahead. So I'm very, very excited. So I will see you in January 11th at our event. So we're going to jump right into our opening conversation here. The theme I gave it tonight is the shadow war among the global elite. And that's a great way to talk about things. But just a reminder, if you've got something you want me to talk about in the second half of the show, Rumble Rants on the Rumble, Cash App me, Caleb Moppin 22. But the best way, the absolute best way to send your questions, buy me a coffee. Buy me a coffee. I don't know if folks saw the big news today is that the U.S. national security strategy has been altered to change the way the United States speaks about the European Union. And we know that even though Trump is doing exactly, in a lot of ways, what the mainstream of imperialism would want. Donald Trump is threatening war against Venezuela. Donald Trump has bombed Iran. He hasn't made a peace deal with Russia yet. It's looking good like that may happen, but it hasn't happened yet. But yet there is a section of our ruling class that is fighting Donald Trump desperately. I mean, they want him out of there. They think he is the most dangerous thing they've ever seen. We also know that around the world, there is a big division among the elite. You know, the political crisis in South Korea that we've been following. It seems like every time a new one of the political party takes power, they want to put the previous party into prison. You know, and that there's this, you know, this situation that we've talked about, and it's, you know, people from the conservative party are all being locked up, ministers in particular, because there seems to be a fight going on in South Korean politics. It's very intense. In Germany, there's talk of outlawing the Alternative for Deutschland, AfD party. In France, they would like to block the daughter of the National Front founder, this woman who is the face of the new right, Marine Le Pen. They want to block her from being able to run in the elections. Meanwhile, Candace Owens is revealing and you know, kind of going to war against Macron, the French leader, and making all kinds of accusations. We're living in very interesting times, and on these streams, we do our best to try and make sense of all of this. That's what we do here on these streams. And there are a couple different ways to understand all of this. And that's really the value of these streams. I don't think people come on here to get the news necessarily, though we do give a lot of updates, especially when it comes to international developments. People come on here to get analysis, to understand not just what is happening, but why it is happening and how the world works. That's what makes this channel so special. And our analysis has many layers to it. And the theme tonight is the shadow war among the global elite. And tonight I'm going to talk about some subtle and not so subtle differences within the American elite and what it means. And I want to start with Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, right? Because Donald Trump, I don't know if you noticed, Donald Trump made a big point of having a portrait of Roosevelt on display at the White House. Mamdani praised him for it. Well, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the only American president that there is a fully documented attempted military coup against. Right? Now, Republicans will often try to claim, or Democrats will often try to claim that January 6th was a coup, but it wasn't, right? There was no way that, you know, the mob of Trump supporters were going to be able to cancel and nullify the election results by running around the Capitol dressed up in a silly costume. You know, and, you know, there are other presidents. I mean, you know, many people interpret the assassination of John F. Kennedy as a coup, but it's not documented to be such. But in 1933, it is well documented that President Roosevelt was facing the threat of a military coup. It was called the business plot. And there were congressional hearings about the business plot. Smedley Butler of the U.S. Marine Corps revealed the fact that a number of high-ranking wealthy people centered around the Morgans, J.P. Morgan, had approached him about a military coup to remove Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt very much could tell that he was facing very solid opposition. There were people who wanted to overthrow him. And they weren't just Republicans, right? The American Liberty League was formed, headed by Al Smith, who was a Democrat in New York City. Al Smith formed the American Liberty League, and he announced there can be only one capital for America, Washington or Moscow. And he considered Roosevelt to be a communist sympathizer. And it was the National Association of Manufacturers, factory owners, the Morgans, the owners of General Electric, industrialists. It was also Henry Ford and others who very much wanted to oust President Roosevelt. You know, the most blatant attempt was apparently the 1933 attempted coup, but they wanted to oust him from the time of that until his death. And why? Well, the issue was that there was a huge amount of labor unrest in the United States at the time, and it was the Great Depression. The economy was not doing very well. And there was a rising industrial union movement, and that industrial union movement was led by communists who were aligned with 1/6 of the planet at the time, which was the Soviet Union. And there was a fear of a communist revolution, but there was also just the more blatant threat, that if these manufacturers like Henry Ford, like J.P. Morgan, like the steel manufacturers, if they were forced to sign agreements with industrial unions, they would lose lots of money. And eventually they did have to sign agreements with industrial unions, and they did lose lots of money. And it was the industrialists who seemed to be Roosevelt's biggest enemies, especially in his second term in office, when he seemed to really strongly embrace the labor movement. But Roosevelt had some friends that were his friends from long before he was president, even when he was governor of New York. They were family friends going way back. And those friends were the Rockefellers, one of the richest families in American history, probably the richest family in the world if you really dig it up. The estate of John D. Rockefeller, the dynasty that was created by John D. Rockefeller in Standard Oil, that entity, if you want to call it that, they were quite wealthy, and they were for Roosevelt. They liked Roosevelt. And there was a clear economic difference between the Rockefellers that backed Roosevelt and the National Association of Manufacturers that wanted to remove Roosevelt and discussed a military coup about how to overthrow him. And the difference was, where did their money come from? The Rockefellers were oil tycoons, oil monopolists. They made money selling oil all over the world. And they were very much tied in with the British and Great Britain and the City of London. And they sold oil all over the world, and they dominated trade routes, and people bought oil from them. And they used their money not only to run the international oil trade, but to run the international banking system, which was based on oil money. Chase Bank is largely considered a Rockefeller creation. And the Rockefellers supported Roosevelt, whereas the National Association of Manufacturers and the Henry Ford and the steel industry, they didn't like Roosevelt. The Rockefellers weren't going to lose that much because of industrial unions, because they made their money selling oil. And so industrial unions were not considered an immediate threat. Whereas to the National Association of Manufacturers, industrial unions were considered an immediate threat. They would cut into their profits. And it appears that those who wanted to remove Roosevelt wanted to replace him with a president who would crush the industrial unions, outlaw them on the grounds they were communist, and then create lots of military spending, which would create lots of money for industrial manufacturers. And that was what they wanted to do, right? That's what the National Association of Manufacturers wanted. Whereas the Rockefellers, who ended up winning out, their feeling was throw a bone to the labor unions. Let the labor unions sign a contract, give people jobs, and that'll cool the class struggle. And that became especially important as Nazi Germany emerged, right? Nazi Germany emerged. There's a lot going around, and somebody asked a question about this, but, Nazi Germany, when it comes to Nazi Germany, everybody thinks they know everything, and nobody knows anything. Right? People will tell you all kinds of crazy stories about how Hitler was actually Jewish and hated himself for being Jewish. People will tell you all kinds of stories about, about this or that, or Hitler's dog, Hitler's cat, Hitler's niece, Hitler's cousin, Hitler's this, Hitler's that, but nobody knows what actually happened. But the big thing was that Hitler put into effect in Germany a lot of economic policies very quickly, and those policies were invented by Hjalmar Schacht. Hjalmar Schacht was a German financier, a banker. Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht. He was a German banker who didn't like the British, but was very, very anti-communist. And he wanted to assert German industrial and economic independence. But he also, at the same time, wanted to defeat the Soviet Union and especially exterminate and extinguish the threat of communist revolution in Germany. And Hallam shocked. When the Nazis took power, they rebuilt the German industry. They stabilized the German economy, with huge amounts of military spending and the creation of a slave labor underclass, putting half the country in military uniforms, the other half in concentration camps. And one of the big stories is that Hallam shocked, the Nazi economist, was sent to New York, to Washington, to meet with President Roosevelt. When he met with President Roosevelt, he told Roosevelt, Germany will not be repaying any of its debts to American banks. And that was what Hallam shocked told President Roosevelt. And according to the biography of Hallam shocked, and according to all sources, I mean, there were witnesses to this, Roosevelt laughed. And he said, it serves those Wall Street guys right. He laughed about it. He thought it was funny that Hitler was not going to repay any of the debts that Germany had to British and American banks, that Germany under the Nazis had been heavily indebted to German and American banks. And one of the things that Hitler did is when he took power, he nullified it, said, we're not paying you back. And that Roosevelt, in his alliance with the Rockefellers and with the British, they eventually got to the point they considered Nazi Germany to be the greatest threat. Whereas the industrialists, the manufacturers, they considered the Soviet Union to be the greatest threat, and they were very excited about military spending. And so there was a division among our elite, and that the forces that backed Roosevelt, you can call them the New England establishment, the Eastern establishment. It was the old money tied in with the British. The British saw Germany as the main threat. And what's interesting is prior to the rise of Hitler, the Soviet Union had actually been sympathetic to industrialists, right? During the early 1930s, right? 1928 is the year that Stalin became the leader of the Communist International, right? There had been the fight, Bukharin had represented the rightist opposition. He'd been defeated. Before that, Trotsky had represented what they called the leftist opposition. He'd been defeated. And Stalin took power and solidified his leadership of the Communist International in 1928. And in 1928, at the 6th World Congress of the Communist International, the slogan was class against class. And with the slogan class against class, the Soviet Communist Party and the Communist International announced what they called the third period. The third period. And they said that there had been a revolutionary upheaval immediately following World War I. That was the first period. And then there had been the Roaring 20s, the period of capitalist stabilization. But now, with the collapse of the stock market coming, right? 1929 is when the stock market collapsed in the United States, but the economy was already sinking in Europe at the time. They declared this was the beginning of what they called the third period of the Communist International, the third period. And this would be the period of socialist revolution, and it would be the period of socialist construction, right? And in the Soviet Union, Stalin launched the 5-year economic plans to build the Soviet Union into an industrial country. And around the world, the communist parties focused on opposing social democrats. They argued that social democrats were what they called social fascists. And in Britain, the communists focused on opposing the British Labour Party. In America, the communists focused on opposing the Socialist Party and the American Federation of Labor and Norman Thomas. And at the same time that the communists were going around opposing social democrats as the main danger, Stalin was courting the industrialists. Henry Ford went to the Soviet Union and was contracted by the Soviet government to help the Soviet Union set up its car industry. General Electric was contracted. The Morgans were contracted by the Soviet Union to help the Soviet Union build power plants. And in fact, they built the world's largest power plant, the Dnieper Dam. Fred Koch, the father of the Koch brothers, right? He was a chemist in the United States who worked in the petroleum gasoline industry. and he'd been sued by every major oil company, and Stalin hired him to come to the Soviet Union and set up the Soviet oil industry. And it was in this first period, in the third period, from 1928 to 1935, the communists focused on opposing social democrats, and Stalin courted industrialists. And in fact, the term captain of industry, many people say, I cannot find confirmation of this, but many people say that term may have been coined by Stalin himself, right? And that he saw these industrial manufacturers as allies of the Soviet Union. And there's quotes from Stalin where he says that, Bolshevism is the combination of the Russian revolutionary spirit with American efficiency, something like that. And the Soviet Union was aligned with industrialists, and social democracy was seen as the main threat. And social democracy was very much funded by the Rockefellers. And, that's, in the United States, the big social democratic institution was the Rand Corporation. It was like a think tank that was run by the Socialist Party and that now is a major CIA institution. But if you look at the history, the Rand Corporation was set up by the Socialist Party as an anti-communist foreign policy think tank. And the British Labour Party, within the British Labour Party, you had the Fabian Society, led by H.G. Wells and others that had all kinds of totalitarian schemes. Malthusianism was quite popular among social democrats. H.G. Wells was very much a Malthusian, this notion of overpopulation, we need to drive down the population. And the social democrats and the Rockefellers were seen as the main threat because they were trying to stabilize capitalism with some kind of managerial scheme. And the industrialists were seen as, hey, they just want to make money. They're potential friends of the Soviet Union. And that was the orientation of the Communist Party and of the Communist International in the early 1930s. But it flipped when Hitler took power. When Hitler took power, suddenly the orientation became that fascism was the main threat and that anti-fascist capitalists could be important allies against the fascists. And, it's very interesting, but there's a lot of different analysis that talks of a shadowy elite, right? I mean, obviously, in 1935, Georgy Dimitrov, the leader of the Communist International, he put forward the notion that there was a democratic bourgeoisie and a fascist bourgeoisie. And the job of communists was to boost and align with the democratic bourgeoisie in a popular front or a united front against fascism. But prior to that, there had been other people talking about a division among the elite, right? Aleister Crowley, the occultist, he claimed to be a British intelligence officer. Some people dispute it, but he actually wrote a novel called Moonchild, which was widely circulated. He had a lot of people and a lot of wealthy British people that paid Aleister Crowley to do, mystical ceremonies with them and other. And Aleister Crowley, his novel Moonchild, told the story of World War I and claimed that World War I was actually a fight between two groups of wizards, the white wizards and the black wizards, and that the governments of Europe were controlled by various wizards, and the black wizards ran the German government, and the white wizards ran the British government, and that's what World War I was really about. Now, obviously, that's a little bit of a bunch of nonsense, but that's the way he saw it. And Aleister Crowley was somebody who did, was paid by a lot of wealthy people to do magical ceremonies for them and, listen to their life stories and offer them advice and, all of that. He probably had some insights into the real divisions among the European elite that existed. Now, his claim that it was all a big fight between wizards, it's a little bit silly, but, it's not as silly as you might think. Obviously, I'm not proclaiming that there's secretly magic controlling the world. But what is interesting is that wealthy people tend to engage in occultism, right? And I've written about the Aquarian conspiracy. Al Gore had Marilyn Ferguson, the occultist, whispering in his ear for many years. Marilyn Ferguson was this very famous, famous woman who claimed to have psychic powers, who, was having events at the Clinton White House, was very close to Al Gore, and was very much tied in with the CIA and the Stanford Research Institute. Apparently, she was being paid by the CIA money to do her psychokinetic or whatever research, and that CIA was paying a lot of money to people who thought they were psychics, and the Stanford Research Institute in California was where they were doing it. And one of these people tied to the Stanford Research Institute, Marilyn Ferguson, was Al Gore's personal spiritual advisor, right? And yes, people talk about Rasputin and the Tsar's family. And, so these things do go on. And right now, Marianne Williamson, right? She is a major candidate for president, right, in the Democratic Party. Before that, she was made famous by Oprah. And she's just one of these mystical occult, type people who, does psychic stuff for rich people. And so the notion that, the rich people who hired Aleister Crowley to do his mystical occult stuff for them, and, that they might know about divisions among the rich and powerful and other people who hired other people to do their mystical occult stuff. That's not exactly far-fetched, right? You don't have to write some kind of horror story, right? You don't have to write some horror novel, but, the notion that rich people are getting together in secret clubs and engaging in, weird rituals, and they pay different people, and there's rival rich people who pay different people to do their occult mystical stuff. That's not that outrageous, actually. Look at the 2004 election. We had John Kerry and George W. Bush. They ran for president, and they were both members of the same club at Yale, the Order of Skull and Bones, the Order 322, Skull and Bones, one of the top 3 secret societies at Yale. And you look at that, and that is an occult mystical thing. They've got dead Native American bodies in their lodge. They do all kinds of crazy stuff. And yeah, Nancy Reagan was always hiring astrologers and all of that. So what Aleister Crowley put forward in his fictional novel, Moonchild, that World War I was actually a fight between the black wizards and the white wizards. That sounds a little silly on the surface, but if you understand it's a fight between rich people, right? If it's a fight between different factions among the elite, the German capitalist ruling class that was grouped around the Kaiser, that was tied in with the German manufacturers, with the Krupps, with the Tysons, with the Schachts, and the British industrialists and the British manufacturers that were grouped around, the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the DuPonts and the American elite. And they all had mystical, weird gurus they were going to talk about their life problems and read their palms and do stuff for them. What Crowley is putting forward, I mean, while it's obviously a fantastical story, it makes sense if you understand the way rich people operated, right? And people even talk about like psychoanalysis is similar. What occultism, was or is for many rich people. Psychoanalysis is a similar thing, right? They sit on the couch, they have the psychoanalyst talk to them about their life and help them make life goals and relive their childhood memories. And, and that's not that different from what the occult folks do, right? So all of this, that was Crowley's, notion, was that it was a fight between a group of wizards. But then, right, going back to the 1800s, you had a lot of Roman Catholics, a lot of Catholic conservatives, talking about the Illuminati and the Bavarian Illuminati. That was a really common theme among Roman Catholics, right? Is that you had a lot of Catholics who felt that there was a conspiracy against the Catholic Church, who very much felt that the French Revolution and the various uprisings were being engineered by some kind of elite. And they specifically called out Masonry. There are many papal statements from the Vatican condemning the practice of Freemasonry. They viewed Masonic lodges and what they taught as being a threat to the Catholic Church. And apparently at one point in Bavaria in like the 1700s, they'd arrested some kind of anti-Catholic conspirator group called the Bavarian Illuminati. So starting in like the 1880s, 1890s, you got various Roman Catholic conservatives and anti-communists talking about the Illuminati. And they, and often they were really talking about Masonry. Masonry was openly practiced, and they didn't like Masonry. They claimed Masonry was actually a continuation of the Bavarian Illuminati, and they were talking about some in the elite were part of the Illuminati or part of the Freemasons, and some in the elite were against them. So there's various theories that have floated around, right? You have Crowley and his wizard thing. You have the conservative Catholics and their Masons versus anti-Masons. Or their, Illuminati thing. And then you have in 1935, Georgy Dimitrov saying, well, there's the democratic bourgeoisie and the fascist bourgeoisie, right? And that the communists of the world seek to align with the democratic bourgeoisie against the fascist bourgeoisie. And in America, that seemed to line up pretty well. If you read anything that the Communist Party of the United States published during the late 1930s, during the Popular Front period, they saw Roosevelt as their ally, and they saw J.P. Morgan and Henry Ford as their enemy. And they believed that Henry Ford and J.P. Morgan and a lot of the industrialists who they were trying to battle against to create industrial unions, they believed that they, along with Randolph Hearst and some others, that they were part of the fascist bourgeoisie. And they happily aligned themselves with Franklin Roosevelt and the Popular Front, which included the Rockefellers and others who opposed them. And that's very, very interesting. It's very, very interesting when you think about it. And that, that Roosevelt was very much battling against his own party. Probably the climax of the fight within the United States during the Roosevelt administration came in the months following the 1936 presidential election. This is a very important moment in American history. Go read Labor's Untold Story, and you'll read about this. What happened, right? What happened? Franklin Roosevelt won the 1936 election by a landslide. He was popular because he had created the Works Progress Administration, and he had hired millions of unemployed workers and given them jobs paving roads, giving them jobs building highways. And Roosevelt had hired millions of unemployed people, and that made him very popular. He had legalized labor unions with the Wagner Act of 1935, and that had made him very popular with the labor movement. And there were millions of Americans who felt like Roosevelt had saved them from starving on the street, and they went out and voted for him. Wall Street was very much against Roosevelt, but Roosevelt was popular. And during the 1936 election, Roosevelt, he gave a very powerful speech at Madison Square Garden, which we have actually reprinted. CPI has reprinted in our textbooks because it's so important, right? This is, our We Are City Builders. We've actually reprinted that speech. And in that speech, he does reference the fact that many employers were threatening to lay off their workers if Roosevelt won the 1936 election. They were saying that Roosevelt, if he wins the election, our taxes are going to go up. The unions are going to gain ground. And so you're going to lose your job. We're going to lay you off if Roosevelt wins the election. Now, that's illegal, right? That is illegal. But they were still doing it. And so Roosevelt won the election by a landslide. And these employers started making good on their threats. They started laying off workers in the aftermath of the 1936 presidential election. And in Akron, Ohio, a group of rubber workers were laid off from the rubber factory in Akron, Ohio. And they said nope, and they occupied their factory. They didn't just go on strike outside the factory. They just refused to leave. They were told they were not going to have jobs anymore. And they said, well, we're not leaving the factory. They occupied the factory, and they called it a sit-down strike, 1936. And after a couple days, the company gave in, and they kept their jobs because they occupied their factory. It was a sit-down strike. They occupied their factory. And then you had, in late December of 1936 and January of 1937, you had the Flint sit-down strike, which was considered one of the most important turning points in labor history in America, where these workers occupied their factory. They refused to leave. The police tried to drive them out, and they took the fire hoses from the plant and they mowed down the cops, with the fire hoses and, knocked over all the police. They called it the Battle of Bull's Run. At the time, bull was a slang term for a police officer. So it was the Battle of Bull's Run, where they sprayed all the cops down with fire hoses, and they drove the strikebreakers out of the plant, and the military was sent to Flint, Michigan. And they expected that the military would drive them out of the factory, but the military did the opposite. And it protected them because President Roosevelt had given them the order. And the workers were protected by the military from the police, from the union, or the anti-union thugs and others. And they occupied the factory in Flint, Michigan. And at that point, the United Auto Workers won its first contract with Chrysler. And at that point, the United Auto Workers became a union. And then you had the sit-down strike wave, this explosion of sit-down strikes across the United States. And it was spawned by a division in the ruling class. Roosevelt feared being overthrown. All these industrialists had laid off a bunch of workers after he won. And so President Roosevelt and the White House endorsed industrial action, industrial occupation, sit-down strikes, and all across the United States. The CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, a more radical labor union, was formed because President Roosevelt felt he was being threatened by his own class. And so he mobilized, he said, gave his fireside chats, and he basically gave permission to millions of workers to occupy their factories in 1937, the sit-down strike wave. You can read about it. And that was a fight between the elite, between the ruling class, but the labor unions were on the side of Roosevelt, and the labor unions were led by communists and members of the Communist Party, which was aligned with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's biggest threat was Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was an influence on a lot of these industrialists, and so there was a division among the ruling class. Some in the ruling class liked Hitler and hated Roosevelt. Some liked Roosevelt and hated Hitler. And because of that division, you got the explosion of industrial unions in 1937 and the Flint sit-down strike wave. Now, all of this is important. We're talking about divisions among the elite, the global elite. All of this is important, and that Roosevelt aligned himself with the oil bankers and with the British Empire, and was against Nazi Germany, and was willing to work with the Soviet Union, reluctantly. He wasn't a huge fan of the Soviet Union, but he was willing to tolerate them, willing to align with them against Hitler. Meanwhile, you had many industrialists who liked the Nazis because they'd crushed the labor unions, and many industrialists who felt like Hitler, by crushing the labor unions, by getting military spending going, he was a model of what they should adopt. And after the Second World War, that fight didn't go away. Roosevelt died as World War II was ending, and the U.S. economy was booming in the 1950s. But that division among the American elite didn't go away after World War II. But before we go there, I want to talk to you a little bit about Margaret Sanger, because we're talking about the Rockefellers, right? Margaret Sanger was a very, very wealthy woman of Irish descent who lived in New York City and was a communist, socialist in the lead up to World War I. She had a magazine, I think it was called Rebel Woman, and she was a funder of the Industrial Workers of the World and the Socialist Party of New York City. And she was all about birth control, free love. And she distributed birth control, got arrested for doing so. She was all about birth control. And at one point, John D. Rockefeller, he committed a massacre. He was tied to a massacre of workers out in Colorado. So she put out an ad calling for someone to assassinate the Rockefellers, and kill them. And she fled the country. And she set up in Britain. And while she was in Britain, a lot of things happened. World War I broke out. And then the Russian Revolution happened, and she didn't like the Russian Revolution. She didn't like the Soviet Union because it wasn't about sex. It was about socialism. It wasn't about sex, right? The Soviet Union was not the free love, free sex paradise that she wanted. And starting after World War I, Margaret Sanger, this very, very wealthy feminist and communist in New York City, wealthy woman who funded communists, she joined the Neo-Malthusian Society of Britain. And she started getting paid by the Rockefellers to promote birth control and abortion. And she came back to the United States. And with the funding of the Rockefellers, she set up the first birth control clinic in America, in New York City. And she had her organization, it was called the Birth Control League. It's now called Planned Parenthood. And it was all funded by the Rockefeller family, because they believed overpopulation was the problem. And she went from being a communist socialist to being a eugenicist. And Margaret Sanger, and Hillary Clinton, considers her greatest hero, and she's considered like a feminist icon, Margaret Sanger. But you read her actual writings. She really emphasized the cruelty of charity. She said that if you feed poor people, you're only making it worse, because poor people are poor because they're genetically inferior. And if you feed poor people, then they're able to reproduce. And then you have more poor people that are genetically inferior. And yes, she was not a fan of African Americans either. And there was a man on the board of Planned Parenthood named Lothrop Stoddard, who was a Ku Klux Klan member and a white supremacist, and was very much an advocate of eugenics. And this was all paid for by the Rockefellers. And if you read what was written by Margaret Sanger, she said the problem was not capitalism. It was man's desire to expand. It was humanity itself. Humanity's drive to procreate, humanity's drive to have more. That was the cause of the economic problems. It wasn't that capitalism, an irrational system, is holding back economic growth. It was rather economic growth itself. Growth is bad. That is the Malthusian argument. And if you read what was written by Margaret Sanger in her various pamphlets, she specifically calls out Marxism, saying that Marxism is wrong. The problem is not that we have an economic system where poverty is created by abundance. The problem is just growth itself, that growth is bad. And she made clear that was not Marxism, right? That was not Marxism. Marxism is all about growth. However, it says that that growth is held back by the irrationality of capitalism. Marxism is in favor of growth. She said that growth was inherently bad. And she was paid for by the Rockefellers for saying this. And the Rockefellers were all about Planned Parenthood. What's also interesting is during the 1950s, after World War II, you had the Kinsey report that was published. The Kinsey report was considered a groundbreaking text in the sexual revolution in America. And the Kinsey report was published. And the Kinsey report was all paid for by the Rockefellers. Alfred Kinsey was a sex researcher from Indiana, and he went around getting all kinds of people's sexual histories and biographies. And he published this book, the Kinsey report, that was very widely circulated. And it was all paid for by the Rockefellers. And it really shocked middle America. It said homosexuality was a lot more common. And apparently he employed a child molester to carry out his research. There was an actual pedophile who, had molested a number of children, who was, consulted heavily about the research. And you can read that's a little bit of a scandal, that Alfred Kinsey worked closely with and protected this pedophile who was molesting all kinds of children to carry out his research. Regardless, that was the Rockefellers that paid for it. And the Rockefellers were Republicans, but the Republican Party did not like them, and they did not like Joe McCarthy. It's all very, very interesting. It's all very, very interesting. And, I'm talking about the war within the elite. And this is all very interesting. But, there's something that happened even when I was a kid. And I was a kid pretty recently. But even when I was a kid, there were a lot of religious people I knew who would not listen to rock and roll music. They thought rock and roll music was satanic, right? They would only listen to religious music. And there was a very famous incident when the Beatles toured the United States only once, I believe. And when they toured the United States one time during the early 60s, they had to stop. Because there was so much violence against them. All right, rock and roll music comes out of the South of the United States. It started with African American prayer music and Pentecostal prayer music, which eventually gave rise to the blues, etc. And then, you had Elvis Presley, who was a white man who could sing black music. And so, they couldn't play black people on the radio. Elvis sang rock and roll music, which was black. And that's why there's still a lot of hatred for Elvis Presley in the black community, because, he stole black music. As a white man, a white guy, he was able to, play black music and become famous. And that, Elvis Presley himself admitted that his greatest influences were people like Chuck Berry. And it was African-American music that he had largely, stolen to make his music or whatever. But rock and roll was associated with the Southern United States. But the Beatles were British. They were a British rock and roll band. And they toured the United States. They played on the Ed Sullivan Show and made a big splash. And they toured the United States. And when they toured the United States, there was so much violence against them. They refused to ever do it again. There were gunshots fired at them on stage. There were bomb threats at almost every auditorium they played at. The Beatles were considered to be a threat. And rock and roll music had largely been rejected by conservatives anyway, but not anywhere near as much as the Beatles had been, right? You would think that it would be Elvis, it would be American rock and rollers who'd be the most hated. You'd think it would be black performers, right? These racist Southern whites wouldn't want their white kids to go to a concert with black performers, but actually the Beatles are the ones that got this like very, very extreme response from middle America. And part of it revolved around the fact that John Lennon had given an interview where he said he was more popular than Jesus. But he hadn't just said that. If you actually read it, John Lennon had given an interview where he basically, made clear he was not socially conservative. And he also made clear he was not a Bible-believing Christian. He was certainly a religious skeptic, and he made that clear in an interview. And that really made people angry. But there was something more to it than that. It wasn't simply that John Lennon gave an interview stating, religious views that were unpopular. And it wasn't just that they didn't like rock and roll music, because rock and roll had been around for at least a decade before that. It was that the hypnotic quality of rock music had been really amped up by the Beatles. The Beatles, what they were doing with rock and roll, they had figured out ways to make it much more potent, right? And that rock and roll has a hypnotic quality to it, right? And it comes out of Pentecostal prayer music, which actually comes out of African religious traditions, right? And that, these Pentecostal churches, they would pray for 6-7 hours, and they would, sing songs that are very, very repetitive and would go on for quite some time. And they have kind of a hypnotic quality, right? And then out of that, right, you get the blues, you get a lot of black music. And out of that, you eventually get what we call rock and roll. And what makes rock and roll so exciting is the steady beat in the music. It's kind of the repetition of the chords. It has kind of a hypnotic quality. And the Beatles had taken almost scientifically what had happened with American rock and roll music kind of organically, right? American rock and roll music was created by people who were listening to blues, and people before them had listened to Pentecostal and worship music and African-American spirituals, and people before them. But the Beatles, it was almost like someone had sat down scientifically and said, all right, what makes rock and roll music emotionally effective? Why does it hit people the way it does? And they had done research, and they had actually done research and figured out how to make a sound that would really impact people emotionally and really impact people. And that's why, you see those clips of the Beatlemania, right? And all the young women crying and moving back and forth and the mobs of women chasing the Beatles. That wasn't all hype. That actually happened because what the Beatles were doing at their concerts had never been done before. And they had taken rock and roll and what the charm of Elvis, the charm of Buddy Holly and all of that. And they had amped it up, and they didn't do it by themselves. The record companies had done it. Now, a lot of people cite the Tavistock Institute for Social Research as being primarily to blame for this. I don't know if that's true, right? The Tavistock Institute does exist, but there's a lot of malarkey written about them. There's a lot of people who make very outrageous claims about the Tavistock Institute and what it did. I don't know, honestly, right? The Tavistock Institute was a psychological research institute in Britain that was created to do propaganda studies during the Second World War. After the Second World War, it was employed by various, marketing firms to develop advertising and such. And we know that British intelligence, MI6, as well as American intelligence, were doing all kinds of research into mind control and all kinds of stuff, MK Ultra and all of that. And so to what degree or other the Tavistock Institute itself was involved in helping cultivate Beatles music, I don't know. Right. And again, there are a lot of fantastical claims people make. I've seen people say things, for example, they claim that the Frankfurt School guy wrote all the Beatles songs. That's not true. The Beatles wrote their own songs, stuff like that. So you got to be careful whenever the Tavistock Institute comes up, but it really did exist. And there was something about Beatles music that was particularly potent. It was very, very effective. And the Beatles themselves came with a very, very liberal socially liberal, embracing the sexual revolution and embracing drug use, social message. And middle America was very threatened by it. And in particular, it was a lot of the churches that, did the same kind of thing in their church. They had the same kind of hypnotic, Pentecostal thing. And all of a sudden, people are going to a concert where they're having the same kind of music and there's no religion attached to it. Right. And so all of this points to the fact that middle America really rejected the Beatles. The Beatles were why there was a huge mobilization against them from middle America, from conservatives, from not just religious people, but conservatives in general. They really opposed them, but mainstream media really promoted the Beatles and thought the Beatles were very good and there was nothing wrong with them and all of that. There was a fight among the elite. And it all gets very, very interesting. Now, who was supporting the Beatles? Who was opposing them? Why? Well, we don't really know exactly. And again, this is the kind of thing where you have to be careful. If somebody wants to go through this with a fine-tooth comb, they can always find a counterexample, right? There's always somebody in the one category who said the opposite. So you can't exactly be clear about this. But it really gets back to the Korean War. During the Korean War, there were thousands of American GIs who were taken captive. And the overwhelming majority of them apologized for war crimes, signed confessions of war crimes, and became communists. And that horrified America. Right? I mean, it was just considered to be shocking. Right? You look at that. And that's when, there was the movie The Manchurian Candidate that came out. That was a science fiction movie. And that's where the term brainwashing comes from. No one had ever talked about brainwashing in America. But in China, the process of taking criminals and reforming them in Chinese communist jails was called thought reform. The Maoist teaching was that if you committed a crime, it's because you had a bad political line. And so you engaged in the thought reform process to make restitution, to come to understand the belief that had led you to commit your crime. And you can actually read about this. There's Americans who underwent it. There's a very good book called Prisoners of the Revolution. It was written by a guy who I believe taught at Harvard. Prisoners of the Revolution, Mao, prison. If I can find it. Prisoners of the Revolution. I can find the PDF of it. It's actually quite a very, very good book by an American who underwent thought reform in a Chinese prison. If I can just find this book, right? They don't want you to Google this kind of thing. Prisoners of the Revolution. Prisoners of Revolution. Where is this book? I am trying to find this book, right? What was the name of the man who lived through it? American memoir. I actually want to find this because it's actually very important. Of this American who had lived through that experience. Wow, I am having trouble finding this. I read this book a long time ago. I had a PDF of it. Yeah, and it's actually a very, very good book. Yeah, it was called American Prisoners of the Revolution. What was that book called? Now I really want to find this book because there used to be a PDF of it. It's very interesting. Was it American Prisoners of the Revolution? Is that the name of the book? No, that is a Chinese book. This is absolutely crazy. No, that's about the, this is actually very, very crazy. Prisoner of the Revolution. This is really wild. I need to find out what this book is, right? Wow, and there's even an audio recording of the author of it. This is very, very crazy. Why am I having such a hard time finding this book? Okay, American Memoir of Thought Reform in China. This is absolutely crazy. Prisoners of Liberation, Alan Rickett. That's what it's called. Prisoners of Liberation, Alan Rickett. Okay, Prisoners of Liberation, Alan Rickett. All right, I'm going to get you the PDF here, right? We spent a long time trying to find out about it. Here it is, Prisoners of Liberation by Alan Rickett. You can read the book. Thank you. Thanks for your patience, everybody. Prisoners of Liberation by Alan Rickett. Here you go. Here's the link, right? It's an important book, right? But it basically documents this guy was an American spy in China, and he was arrested, and he underwent thought reform. And it's an important piece, right? Right? Prisoners of Liberation by Alan Rickett. Yeah, that's the book. But anyhow, back to the main point. So during the Korean War, a number of American GIs were taken captive. And a number of them confessed to having committed war crimes, which there were horrendous war crimes against the Korean people during the Korean War. And a lot of them became communists. And there was a whole lot of research done about why it was. Why did this happen? But basically what it got down to was that these guys, a lot of them, had a black and white worldview. Communists were all bad. America was all good. And so all it took was the shocking experience of getting taken prisoner. And they would get them in isolation, separate from anybody else, where they just had their interrogator. And they would show them evil things the American government had done. Lynching in the South, war crimes against the Korean people. And of course, they would at first say, that's just communist lies. You're lying to me. But they would prove to them. They'd show them the New York Times. They'd show them evidence this was true. And then these guys would crack and become communists. And then they would take them out of the cell in isolation and put them in a cell with a bunch of other people. And they would read communist textbooks. They actually read, apparently, William Z. Foster's History of America, the outline political history of the Americas. And they would be quizzed on reading the communist textbooks. The whole cell would be rewarded based on how well they did on their quiz, on their test. And these guys would become communists. And it was very, very easy to do because these guys had a very black and white worldview. Their view had been that America was all good, the communists were all bad. All they had to do was show that that was not the case. Click. And so the other side must be right. But there were some GIs who didn't change their worldview. Why? Why did they not change their worldview? Because they already knew that America was not such a great place. They knew the dark side of America. They knew the ugly aspects of America. They had a more cynical view. And because they were already a bit cynical on America, when you showed them the pictures of lynching, they weren't shocked. They said, yeah, that's our country. When you showed them the crimes of the Americans, they'd say, yeah. And those guys were much harder to convince to become communists because they didn't have a black and white worldview. It wasn't a light switch, right? In their view, America was not all good. And so just proving that America was not all good wasn't enough to convince them to go over the other side. And if you read what was basically discovered by Project MKUltra and the CIA is that rather than trying to convince people to be fanatical anti-communists, it was much better to get people into a state of ambiguity. And that that actually a lot of the LSD research, and I quote this in my book about Brian Thompson and the danger of an American years of lead. I actually quote this, that when they got people on LSD, they would develop a plague on both your houses mindset, where both sides were wrong. Who cares, right? And that mindset of both sides are wrong, that is much safer, because it doesn't lead to people being passionate and full of energy. It leads to people being demoralized. It leads to people saying, screw it, who cares? And especially if you then get people on drugs, they just kind of say, screw it, who cares? And that there's really a fight among the elite when it really gets down to it. This is the division among the elite. This is what the Western elite don't agree with, in particular the American elite. Some of the American elite believe that it is ultimately necessary to induce lassitude in order to stay at the top, in order to maintain dominance, in order to reduce the population and reduce consumption. They want to induce a huge amount of dispassionate, plague on both your houses, cynicism, hopelessness, demoralization. Whereas other sections of the American elite very much want people to be enthusiastic about America, want people to be enthusiastic about the American system. It's the greatest in the world, etc. There's basically two strategies about how to defeat communism. Roosevelt had said, okay, we'll let the industrial unions come into existence. We'll align with the Soviet Union against Hitler. The industrialists had said, no, we're going to crush the communists. We're going to have military spending. Those were two different strategies. And after the Second World War, when the Great Depression was over, when the USA had a booming economy, first you had McCarthyism. And McCarthyism was the industrialists. It was the industrialists, the military manufacturers and others. And they were saying, all right, we're going to crush the Communist Party. We're going to be fanatically anti-communist. And then there you have the Rockefellers that said, well, actually, the way to crush the communists, the way to maintain our power, is to just loosen everything up. Have a sexual revolution, have a drug revolution, get everybody into a state of, we don't know what to believe, plague on both your houses, and really push degrowth, depopulation, Malthusianism, and we'll stay at the top of the world forever. And that second worldview, right? That worldview of let's not build a fanatical anti-communist movement, but instead let's get everyone into a cynical state of plague on both your houses. That view represents the ultra rich and the ultra monopolies. And that strategy is the more effective evil. And it's taken me a long time to realize this. And it doesn't match. It does not match what we've been told. But ultimately, social control and preventing solid opposition is much more effective by means of inducing lassitude, by keeping people from being passionate, getting people to be very cynical, getting people to, be on drugs all the time, getting people to be crazily sexual and all of that. All of that is a very, very effective way of reducing people to being lab rats who can be controlled. And it leads to pessimism and hopelessness. And it's very effective for stabilizing the world. Right? There was a novel that was published before the Second World War called Brave New World. And it's a dystopian novel, but it's about a future society where people are on drugs all the time. And they're drugged out and stupid. And this guy who lives in the rural areas, this guy who lives out on an Indian reservation, goes to the Brave New World. and he's constantly trying to talk to the people, and he's read Shakespeare, and he's excited about things, and the people are all just completely drugged up and stupid. And they're just walking around drugged up and stupid, being socially engineered by the elite. You read Brave New World. What's interesting in Brave New World is all the characters have communist names, right? There's a woman named Polly Trotsky, Bernard Marx, right? They all have communist names, but at the same time, they worship Henry Ford, and they go around making the sign of the T, right? Instead of the sign of the cross, the sign of the T for the Model T Ford. Right? This is Brave New World, the novel by Aldous Huxley. And it creates kind of a dystopia where, it's this ultra modern world where people are drugged up all the time, where people are stupid all the time, and they can't relate to Shakespeare, and they have no conception of world history. They're not very smart, and they're just drugged up and stupid all the time. And they go to movies that are just ugly sex and violence all the time, and they're drugged up and walking around in a daze, basically, as a mechanism for controlling them. And people are born in laboratories rather than being birthed by human mothers. They're born in laboratories, and it's this kind of dark eugenics future. And that the guy from the Native American reservation who's walking around, he's a real human being who has experienced real feelings and real pain. And his experience is very, very different. And he's saying, you guys are not human. You're not experiencing what it's like to really be human. You're just living in this drugged up, hypnotized state of being. And you're just not experiencing the real range of human emotions. It's a very, very powerful book. But Aldous Huxley was somebody from the elite, right? I mean, he was somebody among the elite. And, he was out of Ivy League schools, and he understood the conversations that were going on there. And then his book, The Doors of Perception, became almost a required text for the drug culture of the 1960s, right? It was a study he did of hallucinogens that became, it was a book glorifying hallucinogens, basically, that became just widely studied and widely, worshipped by the 60s drug culture. But Aldous Huxley, that novel he wrote was he was shedding light on what was being discussed. And if you look at what the Fabian Society was talking about, right? And if you look at what was being discussed by, various organizations at the time among the elite, you read H.G. Wells and his work, and you look at what, the entities, the Round Table Group and others, those kind of groups that were more liberal in a sense. They were for birth control. They were for the sexual revolution. They were certainly skeptical and critical of traditional religion and patriotism, etc. But they very much were dreaming up a kind of totalitarianism in which humanity would be stripped of its ability to be passionate about anything, but would exist in a state of cynicism and lassitude, right? And that is very much what you can call them, the Eastern establishment, the World Business Forum, the globalists, the ultra rich. That's what they believe, right? You read Ferdinand Lundberg and his book Rockefeller Syndrome. The ultra rich are not communists, right? And the John Birch Society and the ultra conservatives, they all think they're communists. They're not communists. They want a very controlled society, and they want to reduce the population. They're very, very open about wanting to reduce the population. Very, very open about that. They want to drive down the population, and they want to carry out regime change. They want to overthrow Russia and China and any section of the world they can't control. And they want to stay at the top of the world. And in order to do that, they want to drive down the population, drive down living standards, stop economic growth so that they stay at the top. And that is very much the division among the elite. Most of the rich and powerful just want to make money. But the ultra rich, since at least the Roosevelt time, have been kind of dreaming up schemes where through a highly controlled society, people can be reduced to a state of lassitude. You'll own nothing, and you'll be happy about it. You'll live in a pod. You'll eat bugs. You won't reproduce. Living standards will go down. The population will decrease, and we can stabilize the system. Right? That has been very much the view of the ultra rich for a long time. right, is by utilizing lassitude, by getting people not to be super passionate in defense of the system, because then they might be super passionate about something else if they change their mind, but rather getting people into a state of mind where they're just cynical, hopeless, everything's bad, there is no hope, taking lots of, that is a way to control people. And this is the Malthusian solution, but it's not just Malthusianism. Malthusianism is the idea that we need to reduce the population, we need to reduce consumption, limited resources, etc. That's Malthusianism. But it's beyond Malthusianism. It is a mechanism of social control. It's about weakening people. It's about turning people into addicts. The most easy person to control is an addict, right? An addict is dependent on something. If you take away that something, the addict is desperate to get it, and they'll do what you want. It's about getting people into a state of being where they are very, very easily controlled. That is ultimately what our elite are trying to do. And it is a mechanism of social engineering, and it is much more liberal. And it's more effective, but it's expensive. It takes a long time. It doesn't pan out the immediate results. And that's what's going on. And that the fight among the elite, the rise of the new right in Europe, the rise of Trump in the United States, the military-industrial complex has never wanted this. They want people to be passionate about the military, passionate about America, want to go die for America. Well, you can't do that if you're drugged up and pessimistic and hopeless, can you? Right? And the elite, it's the same in Britain and France and all these places, right? And it's their strategy for social control is kind of reducing human beings to being easily controlled, passionless, energyless, hopeless creatures. That is their idea of how to wage social control. But at the end of the day, it's all to deal with this exact same problem. And I may be repetitive on these streams, and I may bring it up over and over and over again, because you need to hear it. The problem is that we have an economic system where abundance creates poverty. And with the computer revolution, we have created more abundance than ever before. And I'm going to put on this math video that I've made many, many times. The capitalist mode of production has a problem that has never existed before anywhere, which is poverty created by abundance, poverty amid plenty.
Explain what needs to be explained, what used to be considered Marxism 101, about why it is that our Western capitalist economy is crashing and burning. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to do some math. And I hate math. And you know why I hate math? Because I grew up in America. I went to public school in the United States of America. So I am going to, at risk of embarrassing myself, because math was never my best subject, I'm going to do some mathematics here on the board for you to explain the problem.
I very much enjoyed Caleb's speech.
So if you are creating a product, right? If you're a factory owner, you're making a product, you are going to need the material through which that product is made, the manufacturing materials. So that'll be A.
The simple equation you put forward to explain the crisis of overproduction and the falling rate of profit.
And you're probably going to need to transport the product to where it's sold. That's B.
It broke down where your money goes.
You're also going to have to pay your labor costs. Labor costs are represented by C.
Explanations of those concepts that people are able to understand.
Then when consumers purchase the product, they're going to pay a final price. And that final price is D. However, there's a problem with that.
I like the fact that he framed it that way to make it very clear.
Which is that the capitalist can't change how much A costs. He can't change how much B costs. So the profit of the capitalist can only be extracted from the value put into it by the worker. And this is the basis of Marxism, the understanding of surplus value.
I've never seen it explained so simply anywhere. I've never been able to explain it that simply.
So C, the labor value, is divided. You have C1, which is what the worker actually gets paid. And then you have C2, which is the profit that the capitalist makes. And it all adds up to D, which is the final cost of the product. Now, the way people in the United States who talk about Marxism generally talk about this is they say, well, this is unfair. They say the worker is not getting paid the full value of his labor. But they're missing one of the most important points, which is not just that it's unfair and then people argue, well, what about the employer? He put up the money, doesn't he deserve to be? That's all a distraction. Because the important thing to understand is this. C1 is always going to be less than D. The wages paid out to the worker are never enough to buy back the product that he produces. There is always more products created than there are wages paid out to the worker. And this is the built-in problem of capitalism, the problem of overproduction. And it is always there in the capitalist economy. It never goes away. And they have invented all kinds of crazy mechanisms to try and deal with the problem of overproduction. Part of the reason that the US government has purchased billions and billions of dollars worth of cheese only to bury it in a cave in Springfield, Missouri, is to deal with this problem. It is an ongoing present problem, and it's a problem acknowledged by most capitalist economists. John Maynard Keynes said the problem was underconsumption rather than overproduction, but he was pointing to the same problem. The military-industrial complex in the United States is an effort to deal with this problem, to keep spending going. There's all kinds of mechanisms that they've invented to try and resolve this problem, but it gets worse. What is the capitalist always trying to do? He wants to maximize the amount of profit he makes. And one of the main ways they do that is with what's called labor-saving technology. Get rid of workers and replace workers with machines. As they eliminate workers from the process of production, as there's fewer and fewer workers involved, as machines take the place of workers, the role of C in production decreases. There's a little bit of a problem with that. As C goes down, C2 also goes down, right? As C decreases, C2 also decreases. And as the role of the worker in production is reduced, the rate of profit that the capitalist makes goes down. And this is called the tendency of the falling rate of profit. Only human labor creates value. And this is something that Adam Smith acknowledged. This is something some of the popes even acknowledge. Human labor creates all value. And so when you reduce the role of human labor in production, the amount of value created decreases. And the ability of the capitalist to extract surplus value also decreases. So this causes the capitalist to have to churn out even more products because he's making less and less of a profit on the overall product. He's making less and less of a percentage, so he has to churn them out. So this problem of the worker never being able to buy back what he produces and more products being created than are necessary, this problem becomes exacerbated. And this points to what is understood to be the deeply...
Yeah, that is the problem. Right? The problem is that we have an economic system that always produces more products than it pays out in wages. We can never afford to buy back what we make. And the more productive and the more technology advances, the bigger this problem gets. That is the underlying problem. Their solution to it is degrowth, right? If you destroy the productive forces, if you reduce the population, then as a result, you can reboot the economy with destruction. And that is the basis on which we continue to have economic crises. And the crisis we're in right now is because of the computer revolution, because it has never been so efficient to produce products like it is today. Never have we had a situation where it is so easy to produce products. Computers can do almost everything that human beings can do, and that should be a good thing. But it's not a good thing because it's leading to a situation where the amount of wages paid out is lower than ever before, and human labor power is decreased. The amount of value that is extracted from each product is lower than ever before. That's the problem, right? We are in a situation where the economy just can't get going again because of the fact that human technology has advanced. We have become so good at production. We have advanced technology so far that our economy is crashing and burning, right? And this doesn't make any sense. And there's all this fear of self-driving cars. Self-driving cars should be a great thing, but it would lead to millions of truck drivers out of work, millions of Uber drivers, millions of traffic court employees, state highway patrolmen. All kinds of people would lose their jobs. Why does that make any sense? Should we not have a rational society where technological advancement leads to more prosperity and wealth for all? Of course we should. But right now we have a highly irrational economic system. And ultimately, the solution is society taking control of the economy, rational central planning. And that's why China continues to rise. And that's why the BRICS countries continue to rise. Is there are sections of the world that broke out of Western dominance and did so by having anti-colonial revolutions in which a popular state that led the anti-colonial struggle now runs the economy. And as a result, they can continue to grow because their economy is planned. But our economy is still centered around profit. Profits are in command. And as a result, the more technology advances, the more economic turbulence and instability we have. And the computer revolution has spawned a situation where economic turbulence and economic meltdown is almost permanent. They can't reboot because of this problem of the tendency of the falling rate of profit, of value crisis overproduction. That's the problem. Now, the ultra rich think that this can be solved with heavy-handed social control, inducing depopulation, stabilizing the economy by destroying the population, destroying consumption, just reducing everyone to amount of poverty. That's why they openly say this is what it's about. You listen to what they're saying. You listen to what's being said at the World Economic Forum. We don't need millions of people in the global assembly line, right? And so what do we do with them? How do they exist? Well, we've got to reduce them to living in a lot lower state of being. And we've got to reduce the population overall. We got to make sure they don't reproduce. This is all these horror stories that you hear about that the anti-globalist right highlights. They are dealing with an inherent problem of the capitalist economy. And it is this problem that is forcing the ultra rich, the Eastern establishment, the Rockefeller Round Table Group British Empire faction. That is what is forcing them to try and drive down the population and assert their dominance and will over the economy. And, I don't know, you want to talk about secret societies, you want to talk about wizards, you want to talk about the Illuminati, you can talk about whatever you want, but at the end of the day, there is a very well-organized faction among the elite who think that the capitalist economy and the Western system can remain dominant with these kind of heavy-handed controls. But there are lots of very wealthy people who don't like these plans because they cut into their profits. And the problem is that leftism, socialism and communism, leftist activism has largely been reduced to being the foot soldiers of the ultra-rich in their efforts to contain the lower levels of capital. In their efforts to force this agenda on the lower level capitalists, leftists are mobilized. Socialists and communists, they're not fighting for the workers to control the means of production. They are fighting to help the ultra monopolies control the lower levels. And that's what leftism has been reduced to. It is a movement funded by nonprofits and NGOs that goes out and fights the lower level capitalists, fights Donald Trump, fights the Alternative for Deutschland party, fights the Brexiters in Britain in order to make them accept what the ultra rich are dishing out. That's the problem. That is the problem. And that is what I have discovered through years of studying and trying to figure all this out and spending my entire adult life in communist groups and traveling around the world. That's the problem. However, there's another side to this, which is that around the world, the communist governments now align with industrialists and lower level capitalists. China, their economy it's run by the state, it's run by the Chinese Communist Party, but there's lots of private companies that are part of an overall plan to raise the economy. that follow the party's direction. Russia, there's a lot of capitalists that are subsidized by the Russian government that are part of the Russian government's overall plan to make the country wealthier. And that communism around the world is basically a state. It's not the Soviet Union anymore. It's not a completely government-run economy. It's a state, a popular state that is aligned with an industrial middle class that is working as part of an overall plan to make the country more prosperous. That's what communism in our time is. It's not what it was during the Soviet times. It's not what Marx wrote about. That's what communism has basically evolved into. 21st century socialism, what they have in Venezuela, what they have in China, what they have in Iran. They call it not capitalism, but Islam. What they have in the Union of Sahel States with Ibrahim Traore is they have an anti-monopoly government, a government that is fighting ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron, and fighting on behalf of the nation against the big monopolies. That's what they have. They have a government that is working against the big monopolies and leads a coalition that includes labor unions, that includes small farmers, that includes industrialists, includes all kinds of people, and is centered around a very powerful state that organizes the economy to make sure there is long-term economic growth. That is the new alternative to capitalism around the world. And it is capitalism in a lot of ways. There's a lot of people making profits. There's a lot of all that. But there's an anti-monopoly government, and profit is not in command. The anti-monopoly state controls the banks, controls the natural resources, stabilizes the economy, and lends money strategically in the interest of the nation. Right? So this is the new system that has emerged. This is what 21st century socialism is. And that's why these countries continue to rise. And the irrationality of profits in command, and the fact the profit system cannot handle the problem of overproduction and the glut and the technological advances that we've seen over the past few years. That is the basis for the West destabilizing. This is what must be understood, and that there's a fight among the elite about how to deal with this crisis. On the one hand, they want to beat down the competitive countries around the world. On the other hand, they want to force the population here to take a weaker position. They want World War III. They want a low-wage police state. But the overwhelming majority of humanity does not want that and wants to resist and does not want their domination and wants their living standard to go up and wants a more prosperous life and wants to innovate and create. They don't want to become passionless, hopeless, and drugged up. Most of humanity wants to go out and build. And so we're at this turning point, and that is the basis for our movement, the Center for Political Innovation. And that is our understanding. And there's many layers here of understanding. And it is not simple what we're talking about here. This is some advanced stuff here. And that the people who argue with us, we get various people who argue with us, right? One layer of people who argue with us. One of the main objections we get, since we unfortunately, because we're not as popular as we should be, we still, seem to occupy communist spaces. And one common objection to our belief system and our understanding is you get a layer of people that I would call kindergarten communists. And what they do is they say, nuh-uh, that's not, nuh-uh, communism is when the workers control the means of production. And they're like way behind us, right? It's like, yes, Marx wrote about the workers and the capitalists, and then Lenin came along and said, well, capitalism is evolving into imperialism, and then out of imperialism we can build an anti-imperialism, and all of that. We're like way past that, right? So that's one layer of people, the kindergarten communists. They just want to do the worker versus bosses thing. A lot of them don't support any actual existing socialist or communist government. They only want worker cooperatives. The workers are shareholders in a for-profit company. They're way behind us. Then you get a layer of people that agree with us on the issues, that are opposed to the wars, that are opposed to Israel in a lot of cases, but at the same time, they think the answer is free market capitalism. And this is much more widespread. You get a lot of Trump kind of people that are with us. They don't want the wars. America first, not Israel first. They do want a government that is concerned about making the economy better, but they think the free market can create it. And they think that the problem that we have in America is that we just don't have the free market. And that if we just got rid of the Federal Reserve Bank, if we just deregulated everything and privatized everything, the market would magically solve the problem. Well, they don't understand that the problems are rooted in profit. The problems are rooted in the instability of the profit economy and this problem of glut, G-L-U-T, glut, and the irrationality of the market, and that the Federal Reserve Bank and all the crony capitalism that they are objecting to was set up as a means of trying to stabilize a naturally unstable system. That's a much more widespread objection. We maybe don't hear it as much because we're not engaging with real people as much. We're stuck in a communist bubble. We hear the first objection, kindergarten communism. That's the first objection. But as we expand and as we get to the real population, that objection, that objection seems to be the primary objection out there, is that many people that are opposed to the emerging low-wage police state, that are opposed to the danger of a new world war, that understand we have a government run by an elite that is trying to forcibly degrow and impoverish us all, they still believe that somehow that elite is communism. And in some cases, they believe that elite is coming from China, which is crazy. That elite spends billions of dollars trying to overthrow the Chinese government, spends billions, positioning the military. They want us to go to have World War III against China. They're not controlled by China. But they believe that that elite is somehow controlled by China, and that elite is somehow what they want is communism. They think that communism and Malthusianism are the same thing. And that is a really common objection. And that is probably the primary objection that we have to deal with. But the objection doesn't have an answer to what we just laid out about the economic problem, right? There's no understanding of that, right? As far as they're concerned, that economic problem doesn't exist. And most of the people, unfortunately, that we do get to engage with and explain these ideas to, who hear this, it's just too much. Right. And their response is kind of, I just can't, they just can't handle it. Right. Because their whole worldview is based on Democrats are communists. Their whole worldview is based on the Soviet Union and Democrats are the same thing. Their whole worldview is that capitalism is the answer. And the problems in America is just that we don't have real capitalism. And they agree with us on the issues. They are opposed to the wars. They are opposed to the civil liberties. And they are angry about the economic suffering. But they just can't swallow that pill that the problem is that we have a government that works in the interest of the big monopolies, and that the left are their foot soldiers, and that the governments around the world that are resisting them have the same goal as us, right? That the reason China broke free from Western domination was to create economic growth because the British Empire was keeping China poor. The reason Russia broke free was to have economic growth. Under Stalin's leadership, Russia became an industrial superpower, wiped out illiteracy, and became one of the most powerful, industrial countries in the world, right? That under Gaddafi, Libya had the highest life expectancy on the African continent. Nicaragua in Central America is doing very, very well because they've broken out of this. That the countries that are breaking free, sometimes led by communists, but not always. I mean, in some cases, right? In Iran, they're led by Shia Muslims. In Nicaragua, they call it Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. The countries that break out of Western dominance, these countries do it for the purpose of trying to have economic growth. And that now those governments tend to promote small business owners and industrialists that function as part of an overall central plan. This doesn't match what these people know. These people understand communism is when the government controls everything and crushes small business, and that's what the Democrats are. And capitalism is when we have economic growth. That's what they understand. And so this is too much for them. And this is kind of the weird situation that we're in. Ultimately, the strategy that we have to employ is twofold. It is top and bottom organizing. On the one hand, we have to make ourselves useful in struggles within the ruling class. And when this lower level of capital that is fighting to raise its people, to maintain its right to make profits and resisting the degrowth vision of the ultra rich, we need to be on their side. We need to oppose their wars. We need to fight for their civil liberties. And on the other hand, we need to just build our own organization and teach our own ideas, and that there are people who are receptive to these ideas, They're not a huge chunk of the population, but they exist. And their perspective is important, and that we need to build a solid core of people who can understand these conceptions while we make ourselves relevant and useful in bigger struggles and bigger divisions, right? And that this is a strategy that can be employed. All of this I put forward in the Where is America Going book, right? I put it forward in this book, and I've divided this book up now into shorter books. What is a counter gang? What is Bonapartism? AI is not the problem, right? I have broken this book up into smaller little pamphlets, but this is the worldview. This is the worldview that I put forward in there, that there is a fight among the elite, and it is over stabilizing capitalism by means of social control, and that it is that Eastern establishment that wants a very well-engineered capitalism, social engineering, and degrowth versus the industrialists who just want to grow, and the countries around the world that have broken out of Western imperialism. And that ultimately we need an anti-monopoly coalition against the big monopolies. We need a government that is strong enough it will break the power of the big bankers and control the economy in order to ensure economic growth. And that's a tough pill for many of the opposition in America to understand, because they are used to believing that free markets magically just solve the problem. They don't. They just don't, right? I mean, and that free market propaganda is, I mean, they say things that are absurd. That there would be no monopolies if it wasn't for the government. Well, the government, the big monopolies themselves have created antitrust laws to try and prevent monopolies, right? And that there is a lot of economic malarkey out there that tries to say that we can just that the market just magically solves things, right? So this is deeper understanding, right? I know what I'm doing, right? And there are a lot of jokers out there, and there are a lot of confused people out there, and that we are carving out something new, and we are the innovationist movement. I was a communist for many years, but I believed in God, and I was optimistic. I wasn't destructive. And I had kind of an awakening in 2015. And when I got back and I was organizing, I started saying things like out of the movement to the masses. And it took me a long time to finally just realize we can't be communists, because communism is tied in with all these destructive impulses, and communism as a brand and as a movement is dead. It is a dead brand, right? And that we just have to organize. We have to fight the emerging low-wage police state. We have to fight the danger of a new world war. We have to make ourselves useful to the rich and powerful who want to oppose this overall agenda of degrowth. And at the same time, we just have to build our own organization. And this is not an easy task, but it's what we must do. And that's been my understanding. And that if you don't have this breakthrough, you are reduced to begging for a place in leftism, which I gave up doing a long time ago, right? And I see people doing it, and it's pathetic, right? The left is, at this point, completely controlled, right? There is not a shred of anti-imperialism in leftism anymore. I mean, there's just not a shred of it. Leftism has basically just turned into a wing of globalism. Who's the leader of the Palestine movement at this point? Greta Thunberg, right? Greta Thunberg, the queen of degrowth, right? Because the global elite have realized that, what Israel's doing is bad optics and PR. They had the same woman, the same young teenager that they sent around to promote degrowth and to oppose economic expansion. They now made her the face of the Palestine movement, right? I agree with the Palestine movement. I am opposed to what Israel is doing. But the Palestine movement is at this point just kind of controlled opposition and optics. And all real opposition to the power structure is coming from dissident MAGA. It's coming from people like Rand Paul, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tucker Carlson, Thomas Massey. They're the ones that actually are opposing these moves. The left, the members of Congress, Bernie, all of them are really pretty much silent when it comes to the threats on Venezuela. All of them cheered for the FBI. They said nothing about the Uhuru case. They let the FBI target the Uhuru movement. And so we have to build the anti-monopoly coalition. We have to build up our own ranks. And that's bottom organizing, is we just have to have workshops, and we have to win people to this perspective. And top organizing is that we then have to deploy ourselves to be useful in these struggles, right? We have to disrupt the No Kings rallies and say, hands off Venezuela. We need to rally and support, loudly calling for the peace talks. We need to be in the streets saying, thank you, Tulsi Gabbard, and cheering for Tulsi Gabbard, revealing that Russiagate was a hoax, right? We need to find ways that when there are divisions among the elite, we intervene loudly and become an important fighting force for the anti-monopolists and the forces that oppose monopoly, while building up our own ranks and our own ideology and our own understanding, right? And that's, neither of these things are easy to do, and it's difficult. It is an uphill battle. It's an uphill battle, but nobody is doing what we are doing. Nobody has a strategy, right? Nobody has a strategy than we do, right? The communist groups, their strategy is whatever the Democrats are doing, they do it louder, or they try to organize. If they're PSL, they try to organize the protests. If they're the Communist Party, they register people to vote. They are just on the side of the ultra-rich. And most of the MAGA movement is totally confused, totally confused. A lot of them do support Israel, but even the ones who don't, they don't know what to do. And, they're very confused. They don't have a strategy for building a movement. But there was an important moment called Rage Against the War Machine, where we very effectively intervened and made ourselves a relevant part of the conversation. There are situations now, like, for example, the persecution of Dr. Hak Jahan in South Korea. That's an important case. The Uhuru case is a very, very important case, right? There are moments where we are able to see a crack and intervene, right? When you are working in construction, they say, before you nail, you make a wedge, right? You take your nail and you stick it in there and you make a wedge. And then you take your hammer and you pound the nail in. We have to find wedges. We have to find wedges within the system, right? Moments where there's an opening where we can then take the nail, put it into the wedge, and pound it in, right? But you have to find a wedge. You have to find a wedge. And that is top organizing, is finding a wedge and intervening and making it clear that we are very helpful and important allies to the forces that are resisting the efforts of the ultra-rich to impose their degrowth agenda and their highly controlled capitalism, their degrowth, Malthusian, highly controlled capitalism. We need to make ourselves useful in that fight while we build up our own ranks and teach people this unique understanding. And that is what we are doing. And it's called top and bottom organizing. And that is our perspective. And that is the conflict within the elite. And I hope that this was educational for people. I hope that people gained some insights into this about what CPI is trying to do, why we're organizing. I hope you'll join us at our event coming up in New Jersey. It's going to be great. I hope you'll get involved in our activities. We're doing great stuff. We're in the streets. We're organizing. We've got a lot going on. We are figuring out how to provide transportation to people in the area. Right? We're doing all kinds of stuff. So I hope you get involved. I know David Fox appreciates this understanding. So do many others. We have an understanding that is very, very unique, but it's also very, very important. And on the basis of this, we are building a movement, building an organization. I look at what's going on right now. President Putin of Russia is in India, and they just opened RT India. Big studio for RT has just opened in India. That shows how strong the new economy is, that there is enough of a wing of the Indian capitalists and the Indian economy that is pro-Russian, that an entire RT facility has just opened up in India. That shows you this new economy is the future. A lot of great things are happening, and I'm paying very close attention to Kirill Dmitriev and the talk of the Bering Sea Tunnel, and a lot is happening, right? Putin has been talking about how there are many American corporations that are very excited to get back into Russia. And think about that. If they're investing in Russia, that's going to make them more sympathetic to the rising new economy and at odds with the Eastern establishment that wants to crush Russia, right? So we have an important role to play as a political movement that is pro-growth, pro-humanity, and against globalism, imperialism, and has this unique advanced understanding. So we've got to build our own movement. So join the Center for Political Innovation, get involved. And those are my opening remarks for tonight. I hope this was helpful. And on that note, let's do the roll call. And I'll call you all out as I see you. Names and locations, names and locations. And then from there, I will answer your questions. And there's plenty of questions here. I will answer your questions for the remainder of the night. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. We got Red Axis in Ottawa, Canada. We got Jane in Wellington, New Zealand. Charles in Brooklyn. Jenny in Cincinnati. Ryan in Kansas City. St. David's, Bermuda. Maria in Wyoming. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's the nicest thing that anyone's ever done for me. JT 24 in Mississippi. Jacob in Wisconsin. Alex in Brazil. Ed in Louisville. Bill in Tasmania. Welcome, Bill. Chad in Spokane, Washington. John in Florida. Matteo in Italy. Hey, says Jenny. Tyler in Ohio. Morolam in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Manitoba in Canada. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Names and locations. Names and locations. Anybody else? Anybody else? Names and locations. Names and locations. Has anybody here seen Cali? Kelly. Chris is in Salt Lake City. David Fox is in Bendigo, Australia. Anybody else? Names and locations. Names and locations. Hey, Jenny. All right. Names and locations. Anybody else? Anybody else? Now, a few people have already sent questions via Buy Me a Coffee. I actually need to refill my water. For some reason, my throat, I need to get some more water. You never know what kind of day it's going to be with allergies. But we've got 4 coffee questions that have already come in. Oh, Brooklyn is in the house. Good to see you, Phil. Michael out in New Jersey. Visited him. He's recovering from an injury. Michael, stay strong. Good friend of our community. Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So I am going to put some music on while I go and get some more water to make sure my throat is at full condition. So if anyone can send more questions, that would be greatly appreciated. And I will then use the second half of the show to answer people's questions. That's what the second half of the show is about. But I have to put some music on. The question is, I just don't know what kind of music I'm going to put on. I could put on this clip from All in the Family that I think is kind of hilarious since we're talking about communism. Here, I'll put this on. This is from the television show All in the Family.
Hey, how come we're not moving? We ain't moving because the train stopped. In the tunnel, it always does that.
Well, I wonder what's wrong.
I'll tell you what's wrong, sister. There's something wrong with this whole stinking, rotten, maggot-infested, corrupt system, which sucks the lifeblood out of the honest sweat of oppressed workers. This is the 3rd time we done stopped this morning. But you see, that's what happens when the money-grubbing fascist controls the power, choking off the lifeblood of the people.
Well, you brung that on yourself, little girl. Don't never talk communism in public.
What did I say that was communism?
You said something was wrong, didn't you?
Yeah, classic American television. Classic American television. But yes, I think that came out in the early 70s. And at that time, it wouldn't be uncommon for someone to sell you a communist newspaper or talk to you about communism on the subway of New York City, especially. So, all righty. Let's find something that we can listen to. Goodness gracious. What should we put on? What should we put on? Here, why don't we put on Jupiter from the Planets? I'm tempted to do some Cardew for you all, but I know you all don't like that. So we'll do Jupiter from the Planets Flash Mob, and then I'll start answering questions. So if you have any questions, Buy Me a Coffee /Caleb Maupin is the best way to send your questions. All right, here we go. So there you go. There you go. Thank you, everybody. All right. So as I said before, questions can be sent. Best way is via Buy Me a Coffee, though we also do Rumble rants, and we also do Cash App, Caleb Maupin 22 on the Cash App. All right. So we'll start answering people's questions. All right. So the questions that have come in. All right. First question is from Ian. I heard that Rubio is blocking the peace deal in Ukraine. If that is the case, why do you think the stuff against Venezuela was/is an attempt to keep Rubio away from the Ukraine situation? I feel like the Venezuela stuff is definitely coming from Rubio because Rubio represents a faction of Cuban Americans that all they think about is Cuba. All they think about is Venezuela. All they think about is opposing Marxism in the Spanish-speaking world. Whether or not this is being done in a way to keep him away from Ukraine, Rubio is heavily involved in the Ukraine thing. However, I've noticed when Rubio talks, he tends to give the administration's line on the Ukraine thing. And he tends to say not what Rubio probably thinks, but rather what the line of the administration is. I feel like Rubio is being allowed to do to Venezuela what's happening in Venezuela. He's being allowed to do it in exchange for, for being involved in the Ukraine thing. I will say we've seen some interesting developments. So now there is some outrage against Hegseth for killing the people on the boats, which is good. And we'll see where this goes. I mean, we're in a very strange spot. We're in a very, very strange spot. The illegality, if someone's trying to bring drugs into the country, you arrest them for trying to bring drugs into the country. You don't kill them. You don't extra legally just kill them. And if you blow their ship up and they're surviving and they're in the water, you don't kill them. You don't shoot them to make sure they're dead. I mean, it's just, the fact that anyone is defending this is just completely crazy, right? It's just, if you just declare somebody to be a narco terrorist, I guess it's okay. If you just say that's what they are, they have no human rights. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous. And some of the MAGA people can see through this, like Rand Paul, like Thomas Massey. Unfortunately, there are a lot of MAGA people that, can't see through it. But I don't know about that, to tell you the truth, because social media is very, very deceptive. And it's just like I noticed, we've been supporting Jose, and that there's a whole bunch of bots that are cheering for ICE on social media. But are they real people or are they just bots? And, that raises a lot of questions. Now, Richard Unanimous asked 2 questions. And the first one is, he says, why do trad conservatives or Nazis bring up usury a lot? And why do they say Hitler banned usury? First point, Hitler did not ban usury, right? If you want to learn about the Nazi economy, read Hitler's Banker. Hitler's Banker, which is a biography of the banker who ran the Nazi economy. Usury, the term usury comes from the Bible, and it is the Christian term for lending money at interest, which is a sin. The Bible says one cannot lend money at interest. And it is called usury. And there was all kinds of lending money at interest in Nazi Germany. There was loads of private banking in Nazi Germany. So anyone who tells you that Hitler banned usury is out of their mind. That is just not historically accurate. There were private banks lending money for profit in Nazi Germany. They did have a government bank called the Reich Bank that existed, but it didn't have a monopoly by any means. The idea that Hitler Hitler outlawed the lending of money at interest, didn't happen. It just didn't happen. There's a layer of people. Okay, I just want to say this. No matter what position they take, they are going to take it stupidly. They are going to take it stupidly, no matter what. Right? These were people, I can guarantee you, these same people that are now saying to you that Hitler banned usury 6 months ago would have told you that banning usury was communism. right? They would have said, oh, that's communism when the government doesn't let you lend money at interest. We need real capitalism. They would have thought it was communism. But now that they're in, a Nick Fuentes anti-Semitic space where the problem is not capitalism, it's just one ethnic group, it's just the Jews, right? Historically, Jews were the ones that were allowed to lend money in medieval Europe when the Catholic Church forbid everybody else from lending money. So usury and an understanding of what usury is comes up in anti-Semitic narratives a lot. That's why they're talking about it. And that's that, right? I don't think this necessarily applies to Tucker Carlson. When we talk about the Nick Fuentes universe, that's all it is, right? It's just that usury is something associated with Jews. And so therefore, Hitler fought the Jews, so he must have banned usury. No, he didn't. Hitler did not ban usury. And, they don't understand economics at all, these kind of people. They're just dumb. They're dumb bros. And I don't know how many of them are real. I'll tell you the truth. A lot of them are not real. A lot of them are bots. And the Nick Fuentes is boosted by bots. He is controlled opposition. And that, there's a layer of people on the internet, no matter what position they take it dumb. They take it dumb. They will never take any position in an intelligent way. Look, there was one of these idiots who came into our circles at one point, right? He was in our circles, but he started drifting into these spaces, and he would say really dumb things. Why is it that Russia is opposed to Israel and they're a Christian country, and China isn't opposed to Israel and they're communists? And I said, Russia has been tied to Israel like you wouldn't believe. There's a whole TV channel in Russian aimed at Israelis. And I said, that is like the dumbest thing I ever heard. But in his like trad Catholic mind, China is an atheistic communist, so of course they support Jewish Israel. But then Russia's Orthodox Christian, so they are against Israel. And it's like, that's not actually true. At this point, Russia and China are both opposing Israel as much as they can on the global stage. But historically, Russia and Israel, the Putin government in Russia has been very, very close to Israel historically, right? That's just, and yeah, Russia and China both do business with Israel still to this day. But since October 7th, relations have been bad. But this idea that, and that claim is just one of the dumbest things. And that these kind of people say really, really dumb things because they don't want to think. They don't want to think, and they say really, really dumb shit, it's funny. I'm generally considered to be an anti-Semite by people who don't like me. However, apparently among these people, I am a quote philo-Semite, even though I'm not Jewish. I live a Jewish lifestyle or something like that. These people are completely crazy, and they live in a bubble, an internet bubble, where to most people, they just sound like idiots. But in their internet bubble, they're like really smart because they, have little trad Catholic niche things and all of that. It's a dumb circle. There are intelligent people in these circles. E. Michael Jones is a very intelligent man who's a trad Catholic, who's very smart. And, but there are a lot of very, very dumb people in these spaces. And again, 6 months ago, they would have told you banning usury was communism. Now they think banning usury is awesome. So clearly Hitler must have done it because usury means Jew. They're just dumb people. They're dumb and they don't want to think and they don't want to learn. And they say stuff about the Freemasons that's not true. They're all into the Illuminati and all those conspiracies. And it's just anything but basic economics, right? They just don't want to think. They want to be dumb bros, and they're annoying. They're annoying, and some people may be in those spaces and be capable of learning, but there's a layer of people in those spaces that are just not very smart. I don't know what to say about it. Now, Richard asks, why was there no pink tide in Eastern Europe or the former USSR? Why weren't there more leaders in the ex-Eastern Bloc even close to being on Putin's level? Why has opposition to NATO and the former Western Bloc been rooted in conservatism? Well, there are some, right? For example, Belarus, right? Belarus is still a communist country. It's still, Lukashenko came in, they never had the privatization. So Belarus is an example of Belarus has never had a counter-revolution, basically. Lukashenko has the same, planned economy pretty much that they had at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union. You have Fico in Slovakia, right? He's very much, from the left. He's a social democrat and he's an anti-imperialist. There are, the part of the reason is that the nationalism of the right in Eastern Europe, the nationalism of the right, very much is rooted in anti-communism. So you have leaders like the Hungarian guy who's a nationalist, but he can't, he as a nationalist, he realizes trading with Russia is a better deal. And so as a nationalist, that's what he does, right? But he's anti-communist. He's got an anti-Russian narrative of the history of Hungary. But at the end of the day, trading with Russia is a better deal. And you have a lot of leaders like that in Poland and other places that are nationalists. And they just, they have an anti-communist narrative, but trading with Russia is a better deal. But there are exceptions to this, right? And the actual communist parties in Eastern Europe tend to be, anti-imperialist. Serbia, for example, Milosevic, was a communist, and in Serbia, you have a lot of people that are, Marxists, I guess you could say, or sympathetic with socialism, but socially conservative that are pro-Russia. It's complicated, but the main thing is, why did the Communist Party of the Russian Federation never come back to power after the fall of the Soviet Union? They shot their wad. They were discredited. I mean, they were not able to mobilize the population effectively to resist the counter-revolution. And that's kind of what I'm getting back to about this being a dead brand, right? Is that they were in power for decades. And as much as they might try to say, oh, we're a new party now, we're totally different, their image is going to be, we're trying to bring back the past. The leader of communism in Russia is a guy named Gennady Zyuganov. And the problem with Gennady Zyuganov is that he was the leader of the Komsomol, the Young Communist League, that was his job. And he's just seen as people in Russia, there's a layer of people who really like him. But beyond them, he's just seen as some stodgy old Soviet bureaucrat, right? I mean, that communism in Eastern Europe at the time, part of the reason it was overthrown in the Soviet Union and in Czechoslovakia and Poland and Albania and all these places, was it was seen as very stale and bureaucratic. And that the communist parties in that part of the world have a problem, and that they are viewed as very stale and bureaucratic, right? It's kind of the opposite problem that the left in the West has. The communist parties in the left are in the West are not viewed as stale and bureaucratic. They're ultra left and crazy, right? And they're not for the working class and the people, and they're definitely not for the interest of the country. They're for this woke craziness. In Eastern Europe, in former Soviet countries, the communist parties are largely seen as conservative parties of the past. They're really into the uniforms. They're really into the kind of the ceremony, the pomp and circumstances of the previously existing communist governments, and people just kind of see them that way. They don't get excited about them. They don't see them as an exciting new movement to rescue the country. They see them as people that are very nationalistic and proud of the country's heritage, very critical of how capitalism has harmed the country, and kind of reenacting the past. That's kind of how communist parties are seen in that part of the world. Now, not everywhere. Some regions, they have a lot of support. It just depends where you go. But Soviet nostalgia is massive in Russia. And in most former Eastern Bloc countries, it is a very solid majority that says life was better before the collapse, before the fall. However, that doesn't translate necessarily into voting for a communist party. Right. The other thing you have to remember is that most of the communist parties in these countries did, when the Soviet Union fell or when these countries restored capitalism, they didn't become the Communist Party. They became Social Democrats. Right. And that's the other thing you have to remember is that, like, the Communist Party of Poland, from what I understand, is not actually like the ruling Communist Party of Poland didn't become the Communist Party of Poland that's there now. It became some kind of social democratic party, and that the communist parties of the Eastern Bloc largely, like in East Germany, right? The Socialist Unity Party, the ruling party of East Germany, became Die Linke, which is part of social democracy, which is like a social democratic party. And you have certain people like, what is their name? Sarah Wagnecht, right? And a couple others that are like anti-imperialist, but most of them are just regular social democrats. That most of the Eastern Bloc countries, the ruling Communist Party became the Social Democrats, basically. And it was only like a crew of very dedicated people that became the Communist Party. That's the other thing to remember, that these are, that's another thing to remember. Okay. All right. And I guess maybe we can go to David David Fox just sent a question about the Communist Party of Poland. What is your comment on the recent decision by the Polish government to outlaw the Communist Party of Poland? Well, I've been talking about this for years. I mean, they have been facing this kind of persecution for years. They've been arrested. I wrote articles about this for New Eastern Outlook. I mean, this is an awful thing that they're facing, but they've been dealing with this for a long time. And I must say, right, and again, this isn't going to be popular, but I must say it, the laws in Poland and in the Czech Republic and in other countries that they're using to target communist parties, the legal basis of them is the anti-Nazi laws, right? The laws that ban Holocaust denial, the laws that ban being a Nazi. According to the liberal order, communism and Nazism are the same thing. Okay, they are not, but according to the liberal order, they are, right? And that's libertarians say, oh, communism killed more people than Hitler. That's not actually true, but liberals will never counter that argument. And according to the liberal order, if you believe in communism, you're believing in an ideology that's just as bad as Nazis. So why, if they can outlaw Nazis, why can't they outlaw you? Well, that's just not true. You have to fight for historical facts, right? The communists of Poland liberated Auschwitz concentration camp. Under the leadership of the communists in Poland, millions of people were lifted up from poverty. They industrialized the country. Like, being a communist in Poland is not the equivalent of being a Nazi in Germany. But the laws through which they made it illegal to be a Nazi in Germany, they then argue that, it's the same thing, and that it's a big mistake that a lot of communists fell into, unfortunately, of this attitude of we're going to support the capitalist state outlawing the far right. I used to believe in that because that was part of I was in the Workers' World Party, and we believed that. No free speech for racists and all of that. Big mistake. Because it sets precedents where, it's like, I mean, even when it comes to the Nazi thing, right? The argument, you'll notice every time, when I debated Vosh, he compared me disagreeing with lies about China and the Uyghurs to being a Holocaust denier. And I said, that's not the same thing. We're debating an event that is allegedly currently going on. We're not talking about a historical event. I mean, but that, there have been a lot of precedents set that are dangerous legal precedents. But in Poland, you have a lot of people in Poland, the majority, I would say, have bought into the idea that the problems that Poland currently faces, the problems they had in the 90s, are a result of it's the communist fault, right? And so they buy that narrative. There are pro-Russian people in Poland. There's, communities and regions that are more sympathetic to Russia, but they are a minority. And this is the pro-NATO government suppressing them, and it's wrong, and it should be opposed. And I have spoken up about this, and yeah, there you go. And that the Communist Party of Poland is an anti-imperialist, a genuinely anti-imperialist party. And to be a communist in Poland means that you are taking a stand on the history of the country. You're saying that the communists were not bad, which the prevailing narrative in Poland today is that the communists are to blame for all of Poland's problems. And so you're taking a stand against that narrative. So I hope that was a helpful answer, David. I try to give everyone a thorough answer. So, all right. Now, Penny says, Maduro Trump phone call, and she sent a link. Can you play some Irish music, but not Christmas in Killarney? I don't know Christmas in Killarney. But is this the actual recording of the call? Or is this satire or something? I don't know. Did they release the actual recording of the call? Let's put it on. I'm going to put on Penny's video. I've never heard Christmas in Killarney. I will not play that. I will play some Irish music, though, since you asked for it. Right? But yeah, so we got Penny's video, December 5th. All right. I assume this is satire or something, but we'll see. I haven't watched it yet. So, all right.
Switching to Venezuela for a second, have you checked back with President Maduro? I mean, is your pressure campaign working? And do you think how's he responding?
You tell me, is it working? It's not pressure campaign. It's much beyond that, I think. But I spoke to him briefly, just told him a couple of things. We'll see what happens with that. Venezuela sends us drugs, but Venezuela sends us people that they shouldn't be sending. They emptied their prisons into our country. They sent us killers, murderers. They sent us drug dealers at the highest level. They sent us gang members. They sent us people from their mental institutions. They emptied their mental institutions into our country. And so did other countries, because we had stupid people running this country, really stupid people. And I think probably you had some stupid ones and you had some smart ones, but they were bad people too. Because not all of them were stupid. You can't cheat on elections like they did and be stupid. Okay?
Did you talk to him a second time or just that one time?
What's that?
To Maduro. Did you speak to him again?
No, I didn't.
¿Cómo es que se llama? Duolingo. ¿Ustedes saben qué es Duolingo? Yo fundé algo que se llama Madurolingo. Please, listen to me. The man in the pit is number Nicolás. ¿Qué está llegando a esta hora? Aquí está el chisme. Está llegando a esta hora lo que anuncia el portal del medio televisivo estadounidense Fox News, que Venezuela continuará aceptando y aprobando los vuelos de regreso de migrantes de Estados Unidos, y a esta hora está llegando un vuelo con hermanos migrantes que llegan a su casa a ser libres, a volver a su familia. ¡Liberté! ¡Liberté! Yo tuve una llamada y conversé con el presidente de Estados Unidos, Donald Trump. Puedo decir que la conversación fue en un tono de respeto. Inclusive, puedo decir que fue cordial entre el presidente de los Estados Unidos y el presidente de Venezuela. Digo más, si esa llamada significa que se están dando pasos hacia un diálogo respetuoso de Estado a Estado, de país a país, bienvenido el diálogo, bienvenido la diplomacia, porque siempre buscaremos la paz. Welcome dialogues, welcome diplomats, welcome the peace. Peace, yes. War, never, never in the life. Creo que el camino del pueblo de Estados Unidos y el pueblo de Venezuela tiene que ser un camino de respeto, de diplomacia y de diálogo. Así que hasta ahí voy a decir, porque ustedes me conocen, a mí me gusta la prudencia, el respeto, todo saldrá bien para la paz, la independencia, la dignidad y el futuro de Venezuela.
Este bloque histórico al frente de una nación toda que se resiste a ser doblegada, que se resiste a arrodillarse a los designios del imperialismo norteamericano. Bueno, eso es una pretensión y una necesidad del imperialismo de energía, y eso es un derecho del pueblo.
All right. Well, there you go. Yeah, Maduro is amazingly brave right now. He's not intimidated by U.S. threats. How long is this going to keep going on? I mean, you know, the USA is threatening to strike Venezuela, doesn't. This whole situation is bizarre, but keep in mind, we've stood by Venezuela. We have stood solidly behind Venezuela this whole time, and we will continue to do so. Hands off Venezuela. All righty. And so then I think, so there's two Irish songs called The Jug of Punch. One is more commonly called The 23rd of June. And I think I've never heard this version of it, but I wanted to look for a version I could play on here. So I think this will work. So yeah, here we go. Let's see if this works for our Irish song.
Weaving all at my desire and sitting down all beside the fire. And in his hand, oh, a jug of punch, and on his knee a tiny wench. Oh, diddle-dum the day, diddle-dum, diddle-diddle, diddle-dum, diddle-diddle-dum, diddle-day. When I am dead and left in my mold, and my head and feet place a flowing bowl. When I am dead and left in my mold, and my head and feet place a flowing bowl. And every young man that passes by, he can have a drink and remember I dum da dum da day, diddle dum da diddle diddle dum da diddle diddle dum diddle day. In on the 23rd of June, as I sat weaving all at my loom. In on the 23rd of June, as I sat weaving all at my loom, I heard a thrush singing on young bush, and the song he sang was the jug of punch. Da da dum da day, diddle dum diddle 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 dum da diddle diddle dum diddle day.
So there you go. I guess a more common name for that song is the 23rd of June. And I guess here's another version of it. This is the Clancy brothers performing that song.
It been on the 23rd of June, as I sat weaving all on my loom.
It been on the 23rd of June, as I sat weaving all on my loom. I heard a thrush singing in young bush, and the song he sang was the jug of punch. Ladly fall the dee, ladly fall the diddle diddle dum skiddy diddle diddle dum skiddy diddle diddle dum dum dee.
What more diversion can I desire than to sit him down or beside the fire?
What more diversion can a boy desire than to sit him down or beside the fire? And in his hand a jug of punch, aye, and on his knee a tiny wench. Ladly fall the dee, ladly fall the diddle diddle dum skiddy diddle dum skiddy diddle diddle dum dum dee.
What more hardship can a boy endure than to sit him down or behind the door?
What more hardship can a boy endure than to sit him down or behind the door? And in his hand no jug of punch, aye, and on his knee no tiny wench. Ladly fall the dee, ladly fall the diddle diddle dum skiddy diddle dum skiddy diddle diddle dum dum dee. When I am dead and my drinking's over, I'll take one drink and I'll drink no more.
When I am dead and my drinking's over, I take one drink while it's to the fore.
In case I mightn't get a turn that day, I will take it now and I'll drink away. Ladly fall the dee, ladly fall the diddle diddle dum skiddy diddle dum skiddy diddle diddle dum dum dee.
When I am dead, I end in my mold, at my head and feet leave a flowing bowl.
When I am dead, I end in my mold, at my head and feet leave a flowing bowl. And every young man that passes by, he can take a drink and remember I ladly fall the dee, ladly fall the diddle diddle dum skiddy diddle dum skiddy diddle diddle dum dum dee. Hey, hey, hey.
So there you go. That's some Irish music for you. Now, Talking Mark's Markets says, do you agree that with time, the decline of our economic system will open doors for middle income and lower income people to be educated on why a change in economic systems is vital? Example, layoffs in multitude industries, mergers in Netflix, sports leagues, ticket price overpriced, giving bonuses and perks. Well, all of those things are a way to educate. They're like a conversation starter. They're a way to open the door to explaining to people the problem. And also there's potential for struggles around those things, right? You know, I mean, struggles to demand the food prices go down, struggles to, you know, oppose layoffs, things like that, right? Where people can become politically active. One thing we got to be careful of is we would never advocate against the interests of our own class, right? We would never want things to get worse to wake people up, right? And that's a really dangerous place. It's called accelerationism. This idea of, well, we want things to get worse because that'll wake people up. Yes, consciousness will come, But if things just get worse and there's no resistance, that generally leads to people being demoralized, right? It is not simply economic conditions and suffering that creates a revolution. It is the mobilization of resistance to that suffering. Basically, to have a revolution, you need three things. One, you need a massive crisis in society, a crisis that is so big the ruling class are fighting among themselves. Two, you need a mass explosion of participation, rebellion among the population, people getting involved and wanting to do something about it. And third, you need a revolutionary organization that is capable of turning the mass upsurge among the people into a struggle for political power. Without those three things, you don't have a revolution. Now, all of those things you listed could be potentially the kind of thing that would cause a division in society, etc. The ruling class are fighting among themselves. All of those things could potentially get people involved. But if there's not a revolutionary organization capable of transforming those struggles into a struggle for power, you don't have those things, right? And that, yeah, I mean, I think those are, important topics to engage with people about, and it's an open door to educate people. We just never want to be perceived as celebrating or advocating against the interests of our own class. And we shouldn't hold the illusion that bad things happening in and of themselves are the door to things changing, because that's not the case, right? Taking it on the chin, suffering, the people suffering and losing out in and of itself doesn't lead to a revolutionary struggle. I would say that I have seen things really change. It used to be nobody ever thought anything like a revolution could happen in America. It used to be nobody questioned capitalism. It used to be if you went around saying the America's ruled by a wealthy elite that doesn't care about you, very few people agreed with you. The black community might agree with you. People that were maybe involved in the labor movement might agree with you. But for the most part, the bulk of the population, there was not. Now there's a much more there's a vague class consciousness that's everywhere. It didn't used to be that way at all. People very much understand that there's a group of rich people that run the government who have different interests than we do. That's a very widespread sentiment in America these days. And that's a result of changing economic circumstances. The economy has gotten much, much worse. What makes the United States different from Europe is that in Europe, socialism, especially the first internet or the second international, social democracy, is so much part of the culture that everyone has kind of absorbed that, and they know that that's there, and that kind of sets the tone of the conversation. And in America, that's not the case. In America, we can't expect people to know anything. Overproduction, falling rate of profits, all of that is completely foreign to people for the most part. We have to educate people. And in a way, that's an opportunity, because in Europe, social democracy has been the prevailing ideology in many of the countries, and social democracy sucks. And it doesn't have the same message. Whereas we are going to people with a blank slate. People will have never heard this before. And we're educating people about why we need a centrally planned economy and why the struggle against imperialism is tied in with the struggle to raise their wages and improve their living conditions. So in a way, it's an opportunity that social democracy is not cemented in the culture in America the way it is in Europe. We should view it as an opportunity. All righty. So those seem to be all the Buy Me a Coffees that have come in, and thank you for everyone who sent them. We do appreciate it. Now, Hempcar, we got a couple Rumble rants. So they're all from Hempcar. Hempcar says, not sure how true it is, but I heard Putin gave Trump a big report on how Bill Gates should be arrested. Well, that's cool if that's the case. Gates is a huge Malthusian. He's a huge globalist. He was a huge vaccine fascist. And Bill Gates, he wants to drive down the population. Bill Gates is an awful, awful guy. So if that's the case, I would appreciate that. Hempcar also says Putin banned psychotronic weapons. What is a psychotronic weapon? According to the Los Angeles Times, psychotronic weapon. What is a psychotronic weapon? Gypsy hypnosis? Okay, you're going over my head here. All right, so I will now go to ChatGPT, What is a psychotronic weapon? A psychotronic weapon is a term used in conspiracy literature, Cold War mythology, and science fiction, referring to a hypothetical device that can influence a person's mind, emotions, or behavior using electromagnetic, sonic, or other invisible forms of energy. Okay. Alrighty then. That looks like a rabbit hole I don't want to go down. All right. There's a lot of rabbit holes on the internet, and that looks like one that I will avoid. Now, Bill Binney on the Jimmy Dore says the government burns people with DEW weapons. The government burns people with DEW weapons. What is a DEW weapon? The government burns people with DEW weapons. DEW weapons, right? These are lasers. They burn people. Okay. And he says this is on the Jimmy Dore show. Well, maybe we'll download this Jimmy Dore clip and see what Bill Binney actually says about it. Right? Bill Binney, I tend to give credit to, right? He exposed, he went to prison for exposing, torture and exposing government spying. He's somebody, and he also was one of the first people to say that, there's no way Russia could have hacked the DNC. It's not possible. Bill Binney is a credible person. So I will put that clip on. We'll see Bill Binney, what he's saying about the government burns people with DEW, with heat or whatever. Okay. Like, who has it done this to is my question, right? We know about drone strikes and all of that, but are they doing this to random citizens to see what happens? It's kind of like MK Ultra, or like, what does this mean? Right. Again, I try not to go down these kind of rabbit holes too much. One problem is the internet creates a way that if you have a pre-existing mental health issue, you can surround yourself with people who have this issue and lose your mind. For example, the incel community. These are young men that feel very hurt, rejected. Women, women don't like them. And rather than get over that issue, they then join an internet community of guys who reinforce that on them the whole time. There is an internet community that's called Targeted Individuals. And these are mentally ill people who have paranoia. Not to say that some of them haven't been targeted, right? People get unfairly targeted all the time. But if you look at the people in that community, maybe they got a ticket they shouldn't have gotten. Maybe they had a boss who went after them at their job. Maybe the police wrongly, harassed them at one point. But that community is full of people who think people are following them on the street and think the government is pointing space lasers at their homes. And it's unfortunate, right? And that people can get real, genuine harassment and go over the edge, right? And I've seen that happen, and I have gotten real, genuine harassment, but I have made a point of not going over the edge, right? I am targeted in certain ways, but I'm not. No one's following me around on the street, and that's, there's, you don't want to go over the edge. Right. And, part of it is making a conscious decision, right. Is saying, look, something could be true. But if I indulge this, am I going to feel better as a result? Is it going to help me be able to live my life, or is it going to make things worse? Do I need to indulge this? Right. You don't have to explore every fear you might have about a person, and that's, that targeted individuals community is an example of, yes, people do get targeted, right? But those people, maybe they got a little bit of targeting, maybe something happened, but they went over the edge, and it's deeply unfortunate. So, all right, let's see this video about government burning people. Government burning people. All right. Don't you want to watch the government burn people? Right? Don't we all? I'm just kidding. We're not going to watch anyone get burned. This is Bill Binney talking about. All right. Hold on. Here we go. All right.
I don't want to tell you what that is, because then the government will get wise, and kind of not do it or try to mask it or something. So we're still working on that, and we're going to be putting in motions and affidavits and injunctions to try to stop it.
What are the effects of these direct energy? They have direct energy machines or so. What are the effects of them?
Well, it's like implants that they can stimulate from a distance. Some of it we think is coming from a drone, okay, because we have some evidence that would imply that's occurring, and we'll produce that in an injunction when we send it to the court. But it seems that they can do that. They can also some of the other things are direct energy weapons that burn people, has been. I mean, this is not new technology. This goes back to the 70s and 80s when the Russians did it with our embassy in Moscow. It was used, I think, in the Cuban embassy at all. So it's nothing new. I mean, this is simply the older technology that they're working on much more sophisticated stuff now, and it's like even using brain computer interfaces and how that can happen and how you can reverse that to have the computer feed the brain as opposed to the brain feed the computer.
Well, I don't doubt that the intelligence apparatus has done experiments and that they have the capability of burning somebody from a distance, or they have the capability of using sound weapons, or I don't doubt they have the capability of doing these things. And maybe occasionally they do test it on a random person to see what their reaction is, but it's just not something, I mean, it happens probably, right? I mean, there was a video going viral of them, testing some kind of, pain weapon on prisoners, right? And they've been, they do that all the time too, right? And that they have, and there was like sound cannons they were thinking about using during the Occupy Wall Street protests, right? They never actually used them, like sound weapons, to disperse protests. They have like a machine that like makes a certain sound that like hurts everyone's ears. And it's a way of dispersing a crowd, right? They do stuff like that occasionally. These things happen. I mean, I don't doubt that different mechanisms of social control have been studied. And part of the reason they're studying this is they're afraid that their geopolitical rivals will develop it before they do and use it against them. And, this is a world that, again, I just try not to indulge too much, but these things do exist. But you don't want to be the person who, you have to kind of make a decision, like, how much am I going to indulge this stuff, right? And I unfortunately have known a few people who do go over the edge, right? And they do, start thinking the government's following them on the street and stuff like that. And it's unfortunate. It really is. It's really sad. And, people do get targeted, and, I don't know. There's many layers to this. African Fan says, which type of capitalist condition makes people patient for socialism to produce actual better development of life? I don't know what that means. What type of capitalist condition? What? I don't know what that means. Why was the Soviet Union socialism so fast and tangible? Did it cause its own downfall? Can Cuba follow that pace? There's a lot there, African Fan. I don't know if I agree with everything, even the premise of the question. But generally, socialism, as we've come to understand it in the 20th century, was countries that have been kept in chronic poverty, unable to utilize their own natural resources, unable to industrialize their own economies, breaking out of Western dominance, establishing a state-run economy, and industrializing and mobilizing the population to pave the roads and, set up the, schooling system and wipe out illiteracy and electrify, etc. And that's, 20th century socialism in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union, in many countries. They are very much, it was very much countries that were underdeveloped and breaking out of Western dominance and building themselves up. But after you lay the foundations, that's when they want to have a market sector. And Cuba now has a market sector. They have small businesses and they want more foreign investment. And the 21st century socialism emerges. That first stage, what they call really existing socialism, the Soviet model, is very effective for the first period. But then after that, to diversify for consumer goods, for things that make life fun, you need the market for those kind of things, right? But the market shouldn't be in command, or else you're going to have the same problem of poverty created by abundance, right? You need a planned economy, but within that planned economy, you need a market sector. The Soviet Union very rapidly industrialized. Cuba very rapidly industrialized in the 60s and 70s. And then, in the 90s, and especially more recently, they've had a lot of market liberalization, which is necessary. In Vietnam, they've got market liberalization. And, Cuba, they're very open about, what their plan is. So I hope that this is helpful. Why was the Soviet Union socialism so fast and tangible? Well, they needed to industrialize very quickly because they were facing foreign threat. And the only way they were able to, withstand the Nazi invasion was by building the country up so much during the 5-year plans. But basically what the Soviet Union did was replicated in various countries after the Second World War. In various countries after the Second World War, they basically did what the Soviet Union did. They mobilized the country to have basic industrialization, 5-year economic plans. That was kind of repeated. And the Ba'athist countries did that. Libya did it under the leadership of Gaddafi. That model of a centrally planned economy with 5-year economic plans, with like a ruling party, with a charismatic leader that mobilizes development. It was pretty universal throughout the Cold War. And that was the basis for a number of countries industrializing. And again, people, it just never worked anywhere. Well, gee, why did Libya have the highest life expectancy on the African continent? It never worked, right? It just never worked. Look at what China was before the communists. Look what China is now. Oh, but it never worked, never accomplished anything. Oh, right. I mean, it's just infuriating, right? I mean, you just look at statistics. How many hospitals did Romania have at the end of World War II? How many hospitals did Romania have in the 1970s? Pretty big difference, right? I mean, numbers, you can go down the line. I mean, really existing socialism is very, 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 very good at industrializing countries. So yeah, it gets frustrating when people deny that. That was kind of my gateway drug. Realizing that is what kind of brought me into all of this. I am getting tired, and I'm going to have to call it a night. I do appreciate all the questions people sent. We'll be live again tomorrow night, I'm sure. Saturday night's always a very big night on this channel. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Please register to come to our event in New Jersey, January 11th. It's going to be very, very important. It's going to be a great, great event. We're working on all kinds of great stuff for that event. We're going to have a CPI meeting for members tomorrow afternoon. So we do that every Saturday at 2 p.m. Yeah, a lot is going on. Good times. So dare to struggle, dare to win. And we'll be in touch, folks. We will be in touch, putting on the closing music. New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.